Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy's annual Climate Summit. It's a two-day affair full of newsmakers, change agents, and terrific discussions. This is the start of day one. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of FP, and it's my pleasure to kick things off today. Over the last decade, greenhouse gas emissions have been at the highest levels in human history. The recent IPCC report provided a stark reminder that international collaboration and urgent action are necessary to finance technology deployment, secure clean energy supply chains, and to slash emissions, all while supporting the world's post-pandemic economic recovery. Over the next 2 days, we're going to hear from top government officials, tech experts, and industry leaders from around the world. They're going to tell us what must be done to make good on COP26 commitments and to accelerate the transition to net zero. We're going to hear from several world leaders, including the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the President of Costa Rica, and many more leaders from government, industry, and civil society to chart out what more can be done to support meaningful climate action across borders. You can take a look at the full program at foreignpolicy.com/events. Now, before we begin, I'd like to get some quick housekeeping notes out of the way. We have a truly global audience tuning in today. So wherever you are, we want to hear from you. If you're logged in through our event webpage at foreignpolicy.com/events, remember to submit your questions. You can click on the Ask a Question button to the left of the video player or below the player if you're watching on mobile. If you're watching us on social media, email us. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com, and you can also chime in using the hashtag FPClimateSummit 2022. A note of thanks to our sponsors. This summit was made possible with help from Bayer, BHP, Shopify, the Nuclear Energy Institute, and the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Thanks to them and to all of you around the world for helping us convene this conversation. So to kick us off, I recently had the opportunity to speak with John Kerry, the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. As you all know, Kerry was previously the Secretary of State and also ran for president. Over the last few years, he has led the charge and traveled around the world, working with governments and stakeholders to advance climate action. His job is ever more important amid present geopolitical uncertainty, volatility in the energy markets, and the need to promote clean investments that can support a post-pandemic economic recovery. We had a frank discussion about where we find ourselves and how Russia's invasion of Ukraine will challenge the climate agenda and progress that has been made. We talked about the risks of falling back on fossil fuels to address short-term energy security needs and what we can do collectively in an increasingly multipolar world. So let's listen into the interview. I began by asking Secretary Kerry just how much Russia's war in Ukraine is hurting the world's efforts to mitigate climate change. Listen into his answer and the rest of our conversation.
Well, we don't know completely yet because we don't know how long the effects will endure. We don't know what all of the fuel interruptions, disruptions, and challenges are going to be. But it has the potential to be a very serious disruption, not only to climate efforts, but obviously to all economic efforts in the world and all efforts to feed people, house people, obviously, and to prepare for next fall and winter, when gas obviously will be challenged. Climate has been impacted by it. There's no question about it. It presents a very real challenge to the agenda of Glasgow, Paris, and of countries around the world on climate.
One thing that seems worrying is that as energy prices soar, a lot of fossil fuel executives are smelling a business opportunity. I mean, their stock prices have been rising. They want to drill more, not less. What do we do about that?
Well, first of all, they wanted to drill more before the war hit. That's pretty obvious.
That's true.
And the answer is yes. They have obviously, many of them, not all of them, decided that this is an opportunity. Now we have the latest warnings even of the IPCC telling us unequivocally that we're really at the crunch time. I mean, this is crunch. So people are going to have to get a lot more serious than they have been about accelerating this transition. and not viewing this as somehow a reprieve from the reality of all of the evidence that was telling us we got to get off of fossil fuels, unabated fossil fuels, as fast as we can. That remains the imperative now, and I think even more so, because we've seen over the last weeks and months just the terrifying impact of a unprovoked and horrendous war being waged against innocent women, children, civilian assets of one kind or another, hospitals, bunkers where children are clearly marked children. It's one of the most obscene, outrageous displays of raw, horrible, amoral power, evil even, that we've ever seen.
Secretary Kerry, what about developing countries whose needs are expanding? There are reports that India has been trying to buy discounted Russian oil, opportunism, but why not? New Delhi would say. What do you do about that? Like, what can the world do in a scenario like that where we are increasingly multipolar and there are other countries that, not in the West, that feel like this is a situation they can take advantage of?
No one is going to be advantaged by cheating the requirements that we set out in Glasgow and in Paris before that, because we're all in the same boat. It's one planet. I mean, it sounds trite. The reality is that there are several countries that have the ability to move more rapidly to transition to cleaner energy, and they're just not doing it because they're locked into an old paradigm. And we have to break the mold. We have to change that paradigm. We have to break out of it. Our greatest enemy right now is the status quo. It's really Glasgow that has pinpointed actually the new requirements, because in Glasgow, 65% of global GDP left that conference with commitments, clear commitments, defined in reality, written down, displaying how they will get to a 45 or 50% reduction or more by 2030, and then how they progress from there to get to net zero by 2050. But that's only 65%. The other 35% that's outside of that represents China, which is the 30% of all the emissions in the world. India, that's about 7% of all the emissions in the world. Russia, that's about 6 or 5%. So you start looking at them. If they don't join the effort, you can't get to net zero 2050. So it ruins it for the rest of the world. We're trying to help those countries to be able to join the other 65%. But they've got to be willing to try to make that happen. We can't do it for them.
I have just one last question for you on Russia before we move on to other countries. Anatoly Shubez was until recently Russia's climate envoy. He was appointed by President Putin, but he quit in protest of the war in Ukraine. How well did you know him, and did his move surprise you?
Well, I don't know him that well. I haven't known him as well as I know the person who's been working directly with us, who is Ruslan Eldergayev, and he's been our sort of direct contact with his team. But I have met Anatoly Shubez, and I know he's a person who wants to move forward and make things happen, and did. And I was struck by his departure, obviously. But Russia is problematic because Russia did not have a very strong NDC. Mm-hmm. We need Russia to particularly deal with methane. They have a huge problem. 66% of Russian land historically in last centuries has been on frozen ground, and that permafrost. But that's thawing now as a consequence of the warming. So you've had these fires in the tundra and in Siberia, and you have massive methane leaks that are taking place, not just because the earth is moving and pockets of methane are being released into the atmosphere, as well as into the ocean, but because they have an infrastructure that has not been upgraded through the years, their extractive infrastructure, and therefore they have serious leaks that occur in their piping and in their wells and so forth. So Russia presents a very particular challenge here.
I remember the last time we spoke, we discussed your relationship with Xie Zhenhua, China's climate envoy. But of course, I imagine a big thing on his mind as China ramps up coal production this year. I mean, after all, they had power outages throughout the fall last year. And this is a big year for Xi Jinping as he seeks to secure a third term. So talk us through a little bit what the discussions with Xie Zhenhua and their team are like right now.
Well, what we've tried hard to point out to Xie Zhenhua and through him to the upper echelon of the Politburo and the President Xi himself. President Xi, by the way, is deeply invested in the climate issue, and he is personally making the key decisions with respect to it. And we've really tried to point out to him we're not there's nothing punitive in what we're trying to do here. In China, they go through a pretty rigorous and extensive process of of all the interested parties weighing in from year to year in order to come out with a product. And that product is their latest plan, their N+1 plan, as they call it, which once in place, it's hard to get it to adjust or to get changes in it. And what we're trying to do is work ways that don't require them to overtly change the plan, but which allow them to take steps that they hadn't taken within the plan or contemplated taking, take new measures, if you will. And if those new measures happen to help them to accelerate what they're doing or to avoid doing certain steps they thought they had to take, then you're not changing their plan. They're simply adopting changes as they go along. And that may be the most effective way to try to get things done with respect to the choices that we face for both China and the United States.
You know, I mentioned Chinese domestic constraints, so I think it's only fair that I also mention American domestic constraints. And
for sure,
you've been in this role for a year now, a year and a bit. And Senator John Barrasso, for example, the Republican of Wyoming, recently said that President Biden is, quote, unilaterally committing America to a drastic and damaging emissions pledge. And he goes on to say that this would punish the American economy because America's adversaries like China and Russia continue to increase emissions at will. I imagine, as we're discussing domestic constraints, that you face all these obstacles at home as well. How has that been over the last year?
Well, look, John Barrasso and I were friendly when I was in the Senate, and I like him, and I just very respectfully disagree with his judgment that what we're doing is committing ourselves to something that is negative for the United States. It is not at all. What would be negative for the United States is to ignore this, is to just do business as usual, which a lot of people think we should be doing. Because business as usual, in every study that has been made, every peer-reviewed major analysis of this challenge, business as usual comes out on the low end, the back end, the short end of this adventure, because it will cost far, far, far more money in the trillions of dollars to make up for what we don't do by getting ahead of this now, by reducing when it's less expensive to do so, less costly in terms of building out adaptation or resilience. And the fact is that the private sector in the United States, often a significant base of support for the Republican Party, they've decided to do this. They see the science, they see the facts. So businesses all over America are already setting targets of 2050 net zero, and they're not waiting for the government to do something for them. They're starting to move as much as they can by themselves. I think that's what's going on in the world, and I think, regrettably, many members of the Republican Party are for political reasons, making some of the choices that could advantage the United States to a much greater degree in the marketplace.
Secretary Kerry, since this is becoming an annual tradition for us, I'm going to ask you the same final question that I did last year. So let's imagine 31st, 2022, and you're at a warm beach. You love a rum punch as much as I do. What does the world need to accomplish for you to sit back and savor a drink?
Well, I don't think I'm going to savor the drink over that particular issue at the end of this year, because we're behind. We're way behind. And we're not going to catch up in that period of time. The best thing that we can do at this point is win the battle of getting on track faster. That we could raise ambition more. We could be deploying the renewable technology we have today much faster, to a much greater extent, and begin to bring down the emissions, notwithstanding Ukraine, notwithstanding the pressure people are feeling about the supply of oil and gas and fossil fuel. I think that if we can go to Sharm el-Sheikh in November, which is the next meeting of the parties, and we have a finance mechanism that is defined, and we have countries beginning to deploy faster, which I think they will be, and we have new projects and new technologies coming online that will make a difference. I think that we continue under those circumstances to be able to have some optimism that we can get there. We're not going to know if we get there in 1 year or 2 years, but we will know whether we're getting on a track which would allow us to. For instance, if all the promises of Glasgow are fully implemented over time, not in 1 year or 2 years, but over the next 8 years, 9 years, if that happens, the International Energy Agency tells us we would be at 1.8 degrees of warming by 2050. And that's a huge step forward if we can do that. We're not on that track yet. Let me be absolutely clear. We're heading to well over 2 degrees right now, 2.7 or something like that. But we could get down if we begin to more rapidly fulfill the promises that were made in Glasgow. The one thing I really want to emphasize here, no one country in the world has enough money to make this happen by itself. The private sector has that money. The private sector wants to invest in this sector. They need signals from the government, a tax credit, an incentive. They need to know that the demand is, that it's real and it's going to be implemented. And the private sector is already investing in remarkable ways. So this is actually an exciting transformational moment where we're really at the brink of the new industrial revolution. And we saw what happened in the 1850s with that one. We made some mistakes, we're curing them now, but we have the ability to have just as much wealth creation, job creation, and just as much benefit to humanity. The way to have a safer, cleaner, healthier planet is to reduce greenhouse gases, which after all are pollution. And if we do that, we can get on the track we want to be on.
On that optimistic note, Secretary Kerry, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
And that was U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. As Secretary Kerry and I discussed, the present geopolitical uncertainty is creating a host of challenges, and all of that makes international collaboration more essential to driving down emissions and supporting a green transition. That's it from me today. I'll be back at the start of tomorrow's agenda, but there's lots more ahead today still. One of the goals of this year's summit is to explore how we can make good on commitments made at COP26 and help ensure meaningful action at COP27. And for that, I want to bring in my colleague, Andrew Solinger. He's FP's publisher and CEO. Andrew, I know you have a great guest standing by. Take it away.
In particular, he highlighted that nations He highlighted that nations representing 65% of the world's GDP promised to get to net zero in 2050 at COP26 in Glasgow. To talk about how we'll move from the phase of pledges to actual implementation, I'm pleased and honored to introduce Sameh Shoukry, Foreign Minister of Egypt and President Delegate of COP27, which Egypt will host in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, less than 6 months from now. His Excellency Minister Shoukry is a very experienced diplomat, serving as Egypt's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva from 2005 to 2008, and ambassador to Austria from 1999 to 2003, where he was Egypt's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna, governor of Egypt on the board of the IAEA, chairman of the Group of 77 in China to international organizations in Vienna, and head of Egypt's delegation for negotiations on the international treaty to combat transnational organized crime in Vienna. He was Egypt's ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2012. Foreign Minister, welcome to the FP Virtual Climate Summit. Please unmute and join us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity and I welcome this discussion, and I hope it will contribute to the success of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We're looking forward to the strong participation of world leaders to indicate once again their commitment to deal with the challenges of climate change and to give the necessary instructions to the delegations to show the necessary flexibility and compromise so that all parties can recognize that this process is for the overall good of the globe and for future generations.
Welcome. Thank you so much. We hope so too. And we hope to support you in that effort. Up until now, much of the discussion around climate goals have been just that, talks. You actually, sir, have the difficult job. The stated goal of Egypt's COP27 presidency is to move from the phase of climate pledges to the phase of on-the-ground implementation. You've already engaged in multilateral consultations at the head of delegation levels and a variety of other meetings. Please, could you update us? How are those early discussions going?
Well, so far, I have had the opportunity of conducting discussions both virtually and in person. I've just returned from a tour to Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Pakistan, where I do sense still a recognized concentration on the importance of moving from the commitments, from the pledges to the implementation, that there is an expectation. And we hope that that expectation and that ambition will be demonstrated by the various international forums that might precede the convening of the COP, primarily the G7 and the G20, to again demonstrate leadership and raise the level of ambition. We have been encouraging countries to revise their NDCs. Egypt will be issuing its revised NDC very shortly. We have put out our ambitious strategy for 2050 in the areas of climate change. We've exceeded our expectations for our 2030 ambition for renewable energy from 30%. We anticipate we'll be able to achieve 42%, and we hope that others will also show a determination to highlight and showcase how they are meeting the pledges they have made, whether in mitigation, in adaptation, or in finance. We certainly need to see greater resilience on the part of all the parties to demonstrate not only their intentions, but to materialize those pledges in terms of actual disbursement of finance and to deal with the difficulties related to financing both mitigation and adaptation. I think there's a lot that can be done, and we don't only rely on the governmental aspect, but as Envoy John Kerry, Secretary Kerry just mentioned, we also look to the potential of non-state actors in this regard, the private sector, but also the NGO community and how they can also contribute towards greater implementation.
Yes, I'd like to plumb more of that. I know that President Sisi has said the summit will support efforts to provide funding for developing nations to deal with climate change. How can the private sector and NGOs, as you just mentioned, play a role in financing green transitions and investments?
Well, mobilizing finance, I think, is one of the main components. If we are to expect developing countries to fulfill their commitments, they've certainly have indicated their desire to do so, where they have not really contributed in any way to this problem. Africa, for example, is probably the least contributor to emissions on a global scale. Despite that, there's a commitment to continue to move ahead with ambitious implementation of commitments in the NDCs and meeting the adaptation. Africa is probably the most affected continent with the effects of climate change and does need resources. These resources come at a cost. We're not only advocating that they should be grants, but I think investment can also be a very potent contributor to the ability to undertake this responsibility. But the cost of finance is quite high when it comes to African countries, and thereby there has to be mechanisms that deal with this issue and provide costs, a reduction of the costs of investment so that investment in the adaptation and in the mitigation fields by African countries can be undertaken and not restrict their overall developmental objectives. So we need to undertake those mechanisms, put them in place, recognize where the challenges lie, and find the necessary mechanisms and formats that can provide for that for us to move forward.
Thank you, Your Excellency. You mentioned Africa and the focus on Africa, very important and admirable. And Secretary Kerry spoke earlier about the impact of the war on efforts to reach net zero and how this might set us back. I wanted to ask an element around that and how it pertains to Egypt and Africa, because the climate crisis is of course closely linked to food security, and the war in Ukraine will likely add tremendous stress and costs to MENA countries like Egypt that import wheat, as well as in Africa. And I'm wondering how you think about, these are very complex topics, and I don't expect us to be able to answer that on a quick call such as this, but how do you expect we can manage balance between current events that come in the way of climate mitigation and pressing needs for populations for food and other resources that become more pressing? And I'm just curious how you are thinking about that as we head towards COP27.
Well, definitely, the situation of food security has become exasperated by the crisis in Ukraine, and it is creating quite a considerable burden. I think it's a cycle that we need to break, and to break the crisis, we have always advocated that we need a political solution so that we can at least offset the impact of the crisis and deal with the issue as it relates the impact on food scarcity, on water shortage, and all of the other elements that impact the situation. But the climate currently is somewhat strained, and we recognize that there might be geopolitical tensions that might infiltrate the negotiating process. As the presidency, we will do everything possible to maintain the credibility of the process, its impartiality, and to find areas of convergence, because this is a global issue that transbounds the regional context of whatever security arrangements might be sought. The challenges related to global and the climate change are comprehensive in their nature. We do need to deal with them through cooperation and through the recognition that we will all be impacted. We cannot, no country, no region will be immune from the effects of, if we don't maintain the 1.5 degrees, and if we don't deal with the issues of mitigation, loss and damage, and the finance.
Of course. And one last question for you before we break. We're almost out of time. Earlier this month, you met with U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in Washington. And the prior month, you met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Islamabad. And I'm sure, to put you on the spot a little bit, you are in a position where you need to navigate commitments from all the large economies on climate. Yet, as we've just discussed, there's so much going on in the world. We haven't even talked about the pandemic. How much of the discussions, when you meet with key leaders like this around the world, are focused on climate versus these other critically important issues that cut across geopolitics?
Well, I certainly have a vested interest in always bringing up the topic of climate, since it's taken now a good portion of my attention and certainly our recognition that COP27 could be regarded as a watershed moment in the climate change agenda. And I do sense that there is also a reciprocal interest in addressing the climate change, both at the political and at the technical level. This issue and the momentum that has been created by Glasgow, I think, is important, and is important to maintain. And as I started out, I think the presence of world leaders during COP27, and hopefully there also a positive response to attend COP26, will again be a determining factor in maintaining the momentum, in maintaining the ambition, and moving forward to actually implement and deal with some of the gaps that really need to be filled. It's an issue now, I think, of trust, and the degree that we can accomplish trust through COP27, through dealing with all of the various components in a balanced and equitable manner, we will raise the trust among parties, and thereby they'll be more susceptible to reaching agreements and definitive way forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Foreign Minister. And I'm very encouraged by discussions around climate that are a very clearly common ground that all nations can rally around, regardless of current circumstances. Thank you, Your Excellency. Very interesting comments, and really appreciate you sharing your important plans for COP27. I know that myself and my FP colleagues are very eager and keen to join you at Sharm el-Sheikh in November.
You'll be most welcome.
Thank you. Excellent. So that was Foreign Minister Shukri from Egypt joining us on the live stage here at FP's Virtual Climate Summit. And I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Alison Carlson, who will lead our first panel discussion on the role of geopolitics in critical minerals in the energy transition. And just by way of introduction, Alison is Managing Director of FP Analytics and Events. She oversees FPA's cross-cutting research at the intersection of policy, technology, and global markets, as well as our global dialogues and convenings like this very one you're participating in right now. And I might also add that Alison is quite an expert on the topic that we have at hand right now on critical minerals. She testified before the US Senate in 2019 on the topic following the publication of an FP Analytics special report called Mining the Future. So I'm very excited that she's leading this discussion. Welcome, Alison.
Hi, Andrew. Good morning. Thank you so much. And I'm also very excited to be leading this discussion on this important topic and to introduce our first panel conversation of today, where we'll look at the energy transition and how it will drive demand for extraction, processing, and trade of critical minerals and metals, such as cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel, and rare earths. So just to set the stage for a few minutes before we dive in, as we all know, there's growing demand for clean energy technologies. And in that, the IEA has estimated that by 2040, in just 2 decades, the demand for critical minerals will increase 6-fold. And there's this looming mismatch between our climate ambitions and the availability of critical minerals needed to achieve them. Not only that, the geographic concentration of these minerals is also something that we all need to contend with, and it's driving geostrategic and geoeconomic competition. So to dive into these issues and discuss how we can meet this demand for these resources both sustainably and reliably, I'm so thrilled to welcome our panel today. Joining us today, we have David Kovach, Director of Energy Transformation at the National Security Council in the White House. We also have Jeff Morrison, Vice President of Global Purchasing and Supply Chains at GM, and Fiona Wild, Vice President of Sustainability and Climate Change at BHP. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And welcome. So our time is short, so let's just dive in. David, I'd like to start with you. Last year at this time, the administration was embarking on a 100-day review of supply chains for critical minerals that were considered key to the economy. And last month, the administration announced a commitment to use the Defense Production Act to bolster critical minerals supplies. So I'm just wondering if you can start us off today by highlighting the administration's key priorities and strategies for meeting this increasing demand.
Thanks, Allison. Absolutely. I'm really excited to be with you and joining Jeff and Fiona here, because critical minerals sit at the crux of the energy security and climate change challenges, which are two key priorities for the Biden administration. Combating climate change is central to our efforts domestically and internationally, and the Biden administration is committed to the clean energy transition. So these are really important issues for us. I think it's important to emphasize promoting clean energy and energy security are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand. And so the president has underscored that the path to true energy security runs through clean energy. And as we work towards a clean energy future, it's essential that we do not trade reliance on one set of energy for dependence on another. So we recognize that a key component of this is ensuring that the energy transition has access, we all have access to the critical minerals that clean energy technologies like batteries rely on. Large capacity batteries and for vehicles and for grid storage applications, they're essential to meeting our climate goals. And just those two sectors in the United States account for more than half of our carbon emissions. And I think if Russia's war in Ukraine has taught us anything, it's the importance of resilient and secure supply chains. So, that applies across the economy, but especially to inputs like critical energy minerals that are at the center of our clean energy, climate, and economic and jobs goals. And so that's why the White House has taken a number of steps. You mentioned the 100-day report. You also mentioned the use of the Defense Production Act. And so those are important steps to strengthen those supply chains across the sector's entire value chain. And I think, what we're trying to do in some of those steps is a really holistic approach that includes mining and the production of materials, but it also includes processing and recycling. And that overlaid on top of all of those is a commitment to environmental sustainability, community engagement, and social governance. I think those are really important elements that we prioritize. So, if you look at a couple of the examples of things that the administration has done, you have the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example. So President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, it includes nearly $3 billion to boost production of advanced batteries. But it also is expected to go towards not only battery materials manufacturing, but refining and production plants, battery cell and pack manufacturing facilities, and recycling facilities. And those are going to create good paying clean energy jobs. You mentioned the DPA. That also will have an overlay of not only mining, but also processing, modernization, which to increase productivity and environmental sustainability, and also safety. It also includes secondary and unconventional sources, such as mine waste, coal ash, geothermal brine, and recycling, all of which are really important for increasing in meeting demand, but also reducing the need for expanded mining. There's another initiative I'd like to mention, and that's EXIM's Make More in America. So this was announced just a couple of weeks ago, and this is actually a recommendation that came out of the 100-day review of supply chains. And so just a couple of weeks ago, EXIM announced unanimous board approval for its Make More America initiative, which will help expand production capacity by providing access to capital for American manufacturers. So this could pertain to anything across the economy, but it'll be an important complement to our efforts to address climate change, because we're going to prioritize environmentally beneficial projects that'll include things like battery manufacturing and applications that will use critical minerals. So that's a lot of what we're doing on the domestic side. Internationally, I think we understand that no matter how much we do domestically, the United States alone is not going to provide the world's entire world supply of critical minerals for clean energy applications. And so we're working with our partners and allies on diversifying the supply to increase energy security. Just like with traditional energy sources, the best security is diversity. And so we're working with allies and partners on doing just that. Last month, Secretary Raimondo hosted her Australian government counterparts along with US and Australian companies to discuss how we can cooperate to do just that. And while Australia is a natural counterpart, giving its mining experience and deep resources and our close partnership, we're also interested in working with other partners and allies on other work streams that could include things like information sharing and strengthening cooperation on critical mineral investment to support public and private sector financing. We're looking at the potential of jointly promoting sound mining sector governance that adheres to the highest environmental, social, and governance standards. And on that last point, that's something that's been a priority of ours for a long time now through the State Department's Energy Resource Government Initiative, ERGI. It promotes sound mining sector governance and resiliency in those supply chains. So those are things that we've done with resource-rich partners for a long time. So I just want to leave you all with the idea that this is a priority for us for clean energy goals, for energy security goals as well. And it's something that we're taking a holistic approach on that looks at not just mining, but also processing and recycling and governance issues as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I really appreciate you laying that out. And clearly there is so much activity happening on the part of the administration and broader government on this issue. I'd like to tease on some of those points that you made throughout the conversation, but would like to turn to Fiona now to pick up on the issue of growing demand. And often we're hearing in the media and elsewhere, certainly about growing demand for lithium and cobalt, essential inputs for batteries. But demand is also growing for copper, class 1 nickel, and graphite. And I'm wondering from your perspective and from an industry perspective, how is BHP responding and how are you approaching scaling to meet the challenge? And how are you doing so, very importantly, with the lowest operational emissions in mind?
It's a really great question, Alison. Thanks for that. And I just might pick up on something that David said, which is he said the best security is diversity, and it's a really interesting consideration for us. So BHP is the world's largest diversified mining company, and as you mentioned, we produce a whole range of commodities from iron ore and metallurgical coal for steel making, also copper for electrification, and nickel for batteries. And we use tools like scenario analysis to help us think through the impacts of responses to climate change and how that might impact our portfolio and our strategy. And what we found is that the greater the global efforts to decarbonize, the more demand increases for our commodities, so the better we're likely to perform as a business. And that's really because of this diversity in the commodities that we hold. So as you've outlined, the energy transition has a really material impact on demand for copper and nickel, as well as for more steel for building things like wind farms, for pumped hydro and other sorts of decarbonisation infrastructure. In particular, in our scenario, we found that if we want to keep pace with the development of renewables, we'd expect copper demand to double over the next 30 years, and that we'd expect nickel production to have to increase fourfold to try and keep up with the next generation of battery technology. So as we've outlined, the industry needs to grow if the world is to decarbonize. But what's really important is that it needs to grow in the right way. So it needs to think about, we need to think about the way that we produce these products for our customers and the downstream supply chains that we produce. So it's really about making sure that we can set those commitments and targets for our operational emissions, for example, also thinking through social value that can be generated and the governance around these issues, as well as looking at the decarbonisation in the value chains. I think the thing that perhaps separates the mining sector from others is that, particularly in BHP's case, we have to think in terms of decades. So we have to think and plan for decades. And this long-term perspective means that social value, which is the positive contribution, if you like, that we can make to society, is hardwired into every decision that we make. So when we're investing in a region, we're aiming to work in partnership with those communities for the long term to get those long-term social, environmental and economic outcomes.
Great, thank you. And really want to focus on sustainability as well throughout this conversation. So thank you for drawing attention to that and the importance of diversification of energy supplies for greater security. Jeff, I'd like to bring you in now as well. So when we're thinking about growing demand, certainly the pandemic over the last few years and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really rocked supply chains around the world. And we've been watching this unfold, and there's been quite a bit of attention on shortages of semiconductors, but this also pertains to critical minerals and metals. So I'm wondering, in your role, how are you looking at supply chain security, and what are you focused on in terms of securing the resources that you need?
Hey, Allison. So first of all, just thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. I think forums like this are really important to get our message out and really help with the energy transition. And as you mentioned, part of that we're experiencing even today on our products is how fragile our global supply chain can be at times. And I would say what we've experienced over the last couple of years with COVID is unprecedented in terms of how we've had to manage supply, and it's really made us refocus and rethink what we mean in terms of supply chain resiliency. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is looking strategically at all of our commodities, our partners, our footprints, as well as our different finished goods that we're buying for the vehicles, and working with our partners to come up with a more resilient, sustainable way forward. And semiconductors is a great example where we continue to struggle with supply on a daily basis, even though it's gotten better. And really, we've started engaging directly not only with the semiconductor suppliers, but also the fabs and foundries, in looking at what the capacity footprint needs to be in the future. And we've announced some partnerships. We have others that are in flight, looking at bringing a lot of that capacity here to North America and making sure that we've got supply protection more so. And then I think as you then think forward about EVs, this is top of mind for us. We're committed to this vision of 0, 0, 0, zero emission, zero congestion. As part of that, we want to make sure that we're controlling our own destiny and that we've got the ability to ensure that we've got adequate supply, sustainable supply of EV raw materials. And so some of the announcements that you've seen from GM recently, we've announced a manufacturing joint venture with our main battery cell partner, LG Energy Solutions. We've announced partnerships throughout the value chain for making battery cells. So that includes our cathode active material with POSCO. We've announced deals with CTR, who's a Salton Sea-based geothermal brine lithium producer. We've announced, I think this week, rare earth supply and magnet alloy flakes to make EV magnets out of Fort Worth, Texas. And picking up on some of the comments that David made, it's a lot of this is in strong partnership with the administration and policy to make sure that they understand what we think our needs are and that we've got the right level of support between ourselves to make that happen.
Great. And you pointed out a number of really important projects that are rolling out or being started. And immediately what comes to mind is investment and the investment that will be required to really increase production and secure supply chains. And so I'd like to turn it back to Fiona and then David, hear from you on this as well. But from an investor's perspective, how are investors thinking about challenges of supply and demand for critical minerals in a decarbonizing world? And what are some of the financing mechanisms that are absolutely key here?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really interesting having conversations with investors now about this topic versus 5 years ago, where it didn't really tend to come up in conversation. So now kind of ESG discussions are core to all of our investor engagements, and climate is the sort of defining ESG issue for BHP. Investors are particularly focused in commitments we're making and performance against those targets and goals that are being set, both in terms of our operational footprint, so what we can control, but also in terms of how we're engaging with our suppliers, the shippers of our products, and our customers. So all the way throughout that value chain. So the focus doesn't stop for us at the factory gate. It looks at the entire supply chain and the role that we're playing in decarbonisation across that. I think what's really interesting in working with investors is building understanding, sharing lessons learned about what's working, what's not working, but also finding ways to collaborate. So, working with investors on novel types of mechanisms that might encourage more investment in new types of technologies or new ways of thinking about decarbonisation. Underpinning this, though, I think there is still a bit of a lack of recognition of the critical role of mining and metals to support the transition. So you won't see electrification without copper. You won't see a build-out of decarbonisation infrastructure without steel, and you won't see a scale-up of electric vehicle batteries without nickel. So that I think an understanding of how supply chain, of how the goods and services that you want are generated is incredibly important. I'll give an example. I remember talking to someone about how we define what green revenue is. And someone said, well, I think green revenue is revenue, for example, that might be generated by a wind turbine producer. And I said, well, do you know what wind turbines are made of? And they said, well, they're made of metal. I said, they're made of steel. Do you know what steel is made from? And they said, not really. I said, it's made from iron ore and metallurgical coal. So we need to think through all of the different component parts of these value chains when we're thinking about where capital needs to be invested to make sure that we're actually providing the mechanisms to bring these goods and services to the market that can support infrastructure, that can support decarbonisation, but also make sure that we're doing it in the right way, as I mentioned earlier on. I think the other thing for investors as well is to think through decarbonisation challenges. So investors like to kind of allocate emissions to different sectors and think through how each sector should be planning its pathway to decarbonise, which makes perfect sense. But we also need to recognise that different sectors will decarbonise in different ways, and there are different pathways to get to net zero. So, for example, you might expect the power sector to be decarbonising ahead of the steel sector, which is a much harder to abate process in terms of substitutability. So I think it's important for there to be information coming out from groups like the IPCC and the IEA to help inform a really credible understanding of the pathways to get to net zero, but also really importantly to hold companies to account for delivery.
Absolutely. And we have a panel upcoming in a few minutes about the power grid as well and how to address some of those issues there. So for all of those tuning in now, please stay tuned for that conversation. I'd like to turn it back to you, David, from your perspective and thinking through government and government's role in terms of investment. What are some of the key priorities there?
Sure. Thanks, Alison. It's a great question, and it's one that we've spent a lot of time on. I think, first of all, government has to have a little bit of humility and foster some really close relationships with industry to understand what those challenges are and what the needs are of industry. We can't just come up with these solutions on our own in a bubble. We have to understand the businesses. And so fostering relationships and really having close communication with the sector that's doing the work is important. And that's something we prioritize doing. I'd also say that having long-term policy signals and clear goals is really important. And so that's something I think the Biden administration has made really clear, right? We are absolutely committed to the clean energy transformation. That's something that we're going to be driving towards. And I don't think that there's any doubt in anybody's mind that's where we're headed. And then, we have things that we can do, different tools the U.S. government has that we're looking into. Our United States Trade and Development Agency has the ability to finance feed studies for major projects overseas. Our Development Finance Corporation can provide certain amounts of financing for some of these kinds of projects. That's something they're looking into. And I've already spoken about the XM's abilities as well. So I think we have a suite of tools. We're very interested in seeing how we can deploy them creatively. And we're really trying to just foster those important advisory, relationships with industry to make sure that we're doing so in an efficient way that is actually sending the right kind of signals needed to make that investment.
Absolutely. And those partnerships are key. I'd like to pick up on two things that were mentioned, Fiona, by you and by David as you as well, and then bring Jeff in. Thinking about investors and investment and need to account for efforts to decarbonize and reduce emissions throughout the value chain and supply chains. It brings to mind accountability, accounting, tracking, and tracing emissions. And so, Jeff, from your perspective, how do you think about that, about tracking and accounting for the environmental and social impact throughout supply chains? And what types of technologies and partnerships are you thinking through as you're working to secure supply chains?
So Alison, actually on Monday, we made an announcement really focused on an ESG pledge that we were making with our suppliers. And so we've partnered with a company, EcoVadis, and EcoVadis is helping us to survey not only sustainability and pledges to get scope 1 and 2 emissions to meet goals by 2035 to 2038, depending on the industry that you're in, as well as doing certification on labor and human rights. And so as we look at our supply base today, already through the work that we've done prior to this announcement, we've got over half of our supplier spend with suppliers who have signed up to this pledge and have made that commitment. And the goal is to use systems like EcoVadis has to help us with being able to measure and to track supplier performance in these areas. And as we go forward, we're getting deeper into value chains, and as we think about EV raw materials, the actual mined assets are important, and we want to make sure that we secure that. Where we're seeing the bigger opportunity is actually to optimize the processing steps from that mineral to where we actually make a battery, and looking at more sustainable ways to do that, trying to eliminate processing steps, and again, I would see those over time, folding into this sustainability pledge that we've made as well.
Great, thank you. And digging a little bit more into the sustainability pledges, I'd like to bring in an audience question right now and turn it back to you, Fiona. This is from Thomas Pickford, who is joining us from London today, and he's at King's College in London. And he asks, how do we make sure that the green transition doesn't mean sacrificing specific people and places? Places like the Chilean salt flats or the copper belt in the DRC are likely to see a huge increase in extraction to fuel this transition. And so his question is, how can we make sure that European or North American decisions or others don't harm communities and people in these areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Thomas, for sending that one through. I think the important thing here is to think through how decisions get made and the broad range of stakeholders who are involved in those decision-making processes. So when we make decisions about investments, we don't make decisions in isolation. So we have a really, really strong focus on engaging with a range of different stakeholders who could be impacted in those decisions, including, for example, communities, and a very strong commitment to, for example, free, prior and informed consent before we will access any of those resources for development. That enables us to make sure that we can actually secure what we call social value. So this long-term commitment and this long-term generation of value for communities. Because when we know when we go into locations, whether we're entering locations or exiting locations, we have long-term relationships with the communities where we're operating. And we need to understand what the benefits are that can be delivered to those communities and have that participatory process in understanding how these activities will be structured. So for us, it's really about understanding not just the financial value that can be generated, but a really, really strong focus on social value, because that's what underpins success for us in the long term.
Thank you. Thank you for diving into that. And focusing on a just transition is obviously so important and a part of many of our discussions over the next 2 days. Another thing I'd like to dig into, which was brought up earlier, David, by you, and I'd like to dig into it a little bit more, is we've been talking a lot about production and increasing extraction, but would really like to focus a bit now before we have to transition out of this panel on advanced recycling and materials recovery. What can we do with what we have, and how can those systems be invested in, expanded, and scaled so there's greater materials recovery as well to mitigate the amount of extraction that needs to happen to meet this demand? David, I'd like to go to you and briefly to Jeff before we transition into our next panel.
Sure. Thanks, Allison. Great question. I think that's something that we've prioritized, frankly. If you look at the decisions that we've made in terms of funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that a good deal of that funding is going to go to jumpstarting the recycling of battery metals. It's something that's been included in the Defense Production Act that's gone towards critical minerals. It's something that could be applied potentially to the XM Make More in America. So that's something that we think is hugely important because, as long as we are growing the need for these materials, there's absolutely going to be a long-term need for mining. The question is, what can we do to make the most out of the materials that we've already mined to make sure that these clean energy technologies of the future have the lowest possible footprint in carbon embedded emissions. So we think that's hugely important. It's something that we've prioritized through all our decisions, and so I think you've seen that through the legislation and where we've put our resources.
Absolutely. And Jeff, if I could ask for your input here as well, how are you thinking about that in the expansion of recycling and materials recovery for securing supply chains?
So 100% of our Ultium batteries are recyclable. So, that's an important part of the value chain. And so we're thinking about, partners that can recycle in the most efficient, sustainable way so that we have maximum recovery of the precious metals that we want to get back. Today we probably have a very low car park of EVs and batteries that are coming back for recycling. One of the things that we see is EV batteries have a really long life, and the life likely goes beyond even the initial vehicle life. And so, we've started looking at life cycle management to have secondary use applications where we can take a battery maybe at the end of the automotive life that still has 60 to 70% of its useful life and use that in other applications. But then ultimately when it is ready to be recycled and reclaiming the metals, to be able to do that not only in a most efficient way with the right partners, but even from a location standpoint, to have that located in such a way that we can efficiently feed the metals back into our battery making process.
Great, thank you. And one quick last question from the audience before we're transitioning into the next panel. And Fiona, this one is for you. This is coming from Piotr Mehi, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, out of the UK and the Climate Adaptation and Resilience at the UK government. And he asks, this set of issues demonstrates the link between the need to mitigate climate change through the clean energy transition and the need to adapt and build resilience to climate risk. So what does the private sector need from governments as well as finance to support the resilience of supply chains and support infrastructure to climate-related shocks from extreme weather? That's a big question, I know, and we're running out of time, but Fiona, would like you to respond quickly if you could.
Okay, I think it is a complicated question to answer in a short period of time. What I would say is the private sector in general, I think, has focused primarily on managing transition risks associated with climate. So how do we manage the response to climate, as opposed to sort of prioritizing the physical impacts of climate change? But we're starting to see that changing. One of the first things we need to be able to do that really well is an understanding of what the climate impacts are likely to be. So really good access to data to enable us to understand, not just at the macro scale, but at the local scale, what does climate change mean across a range of different scenarios for individual towns, individual communities. So access to that data is incredibly important. And then a collaborative approach to thinking through the risks that climate poses and a range of measures that can be put in place to manage those, whether it's changing management practices, whether it's looking at natural climate solutions to build resilience, or whether it's engineering solutions that we might need. So I think it's really having great access to data, but also making sure that we can bring in a whole range of different stakeholders as we think through risk assessment processes, but also as we think through solutions. This isn't just about engineering our way out of solutions. There's a whole lot of other things we can do, particularly in terms of natural climate solutions that can give us community benefits, watershed benefits, and biodiversity benefits, which are increasingly important as climate takes hold.
Wonderful and very well put. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Fiona Wild, Jeff Morrison, and David Kovach, really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we're fortunately out of time for that panel, but would like to transition into our next. We'd like to welcome Maggie Lake, a veteran journalist and founder of Maggie Lake Media, to help explore how cities around the world are leading on climate action. Hi, Maggie, welcome.
Hi there, Allison. Thanks so much. That was a great conversation about a really important topic, and excited to continue to this next, where we are going to dig deeper into how cities can help fight the climate crisis. And I'm happy to introduce Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London and Chair of C40. Mayor Khan, welcome to the Climate Summit.
Good to speak to you, Maggie. Good to be here.
It certainly is. And you know, we are having these conversations at a time when we are facing so many challenges. We're dealing with war, skyrocketing energy prices, inflation. I'd like to start off by just getting sort of your take on how these developments have impacted your efforts to transition and address climate change in the City of London.
Well, one of the things that's obvious is the last 2 years we've been preoccupied with this awful pandemic. One of the things we've tried to get across mayors of great cities across the globe is the pandemic pales in comparison to the climate crisis we face in terms of loss of life, in terms of loss of livelihood, and in terms of the urgency we are facing. And I'm a firm believer in, I'm afraid I didn't say this originally, but I believe in it, which is if the 19th century is known for nation empires, 20th century for nation states, the 21st century is about cities and mayors. And we've got to be the doers in taking action to address the climate emergency. And the most recent report from the IPCC, for the first time, had an entire chapter on cities and the impact on cities. So we face the brunt of the climate catastrophe, but I think we have the solutions to take meaningful action to address it as well.
So what is it about cities that makes them so uniquely, and leaders like yourself, so uniquely positioned to lead the transition to greener energy and reduced carbon?
Well, my observation from looking at this debate over the last 20 years is politicians break down into three categories. You've got the climate change deniers, thankfully fewer of those now than 20 years ago. The climate change delayers, kicking the can down the road. Let's take action in 2035, in 2040, in 2050, in 2070. And the climate change doers, the mayors. And there's a variety of reasons why we're doing stuff. We're nearer to our citizens. We walk the walk, use our metros, breathe in this toxic air caused by the climate catastrophe, and our citizens demand more from us. And the good news is, from Accra to Freetown, from Paris to London, from Barcelona to Dhaka, we're taking action, reducing carbon emissions, reducing the toxic air, and being part of the solution rather than the problem.
And I think we've talked about this many times. We all can agree that, you know, during the pandemic, everyone got a peek at what is possible when we make coordinated, dramatic change. And there's nothing like seeing that for ourselves to help motivate everyone. So let's sort of narrow it down to London for a minute, and then I want to expand to C40. You've put, as have many of your colleagues, ambitious targets, zero carbon by, I think it is 2030 in London. How are you prioritizing projects?
Well, firstly, you've got to take people with you, because if you don't, you lose the election, the other guy wins, and he or she's worse than you are. So in 2016, when I first became mayor, it was clear to me that when people talked about climate change, they thought there was an environmental crisis affecting us in 20, 30 years' time, and affecting the Pacific Islands or the Global South or Sub-Saharan Africa, not us. And so we had to turn it into a now issue. And so we turned what's an environmental crisis into a health crisis. Why do I say that? Because the air we breathe in our cities is killing us. Premature deaths, stunted lungs, asthma, cancer, heart disease, etc. So we across London now have the biggest number of air quality monitors of any city in the world. Why? So the Londoners could see in real time how bad this stuff was we were breathing in. And that gave us the permission to have bold policies. So we have the world's first ultra low emission zone. It applies the polluter pays principle. If your vehicle is polluting, churning out nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, carbon, you've got to pay £12.50 to bring your car in to the centre of our city. And we've seen the number of compliant vehicles going from 39% to more than 93%. Toxic air gone down by almost a half in the centre of our city, particulate matter down, carbon emissions down. And there's a great saying attributed to Winston Churchill, which is, and apologies for using the word opportunity when it comes to the pandemic, but don't waste a crisis. And the pandemic provided us with an opportunity, as you said, Maggie, because people got to imagine what our cities could be like with fewer vehicles, with the air being cleaner, with more cycling, with more walking. And so we've used that opportunity to increase fivefold the amount of cycle lanes, widen our pavements, plant more trees, green our city. And we're across the globe, you're seeing cities across the globe doing similar things. And our frustration is the lack of powers and resources given to us by national governments. And in the lead up to COP27, we're hoping the UN understands that for us to solve this, cities and mayors need to be around the table.
Yeah, a couple of things spring to mind. There is a saying that is also not original to me, but one that really resonates now. If you can measure it, you can manage it, right? I know CFOs love to use that, especially when it comes to this. But what you're talking about in terms of air pollution is evidence of that, right? And I think why that's so important. Talk to me a little bit more about what you need from national governments and the international community on the local level for you to be able to scale some of this. You want a seat at the table. What does that look like? What policies can be put in place to help accelerate what you're doing and your colleagues in C40 are doing on a city level? What's missing?
I'll give you some examples, Maggie, of the things we could be doing. So we often talk in abstract terms about a just transition. What a just transition means to me is to make sure those least responsible for getting us to where we are, the poorest, don't pay the highest price for this. So one example, we want to move those who drive polluting vehicles away from those to either electric vehicles or walking and cycling. So we want to give them some funds to scrap their old car and assistance to buy an electric vehicle or a cleaner vehicle, or to buy a bike or pass for public transport or whatever. So we need support from the government for scrappage schemes. I'll give you another example. We know, and Ukraine's brought this to the fore in relation to the barbaric aggression of Putin, but also energy prices going up. Actually, there shouldn't be an opportunity for a green pass to forget about sustainable energy and to dig more for gas and oil. What we should do is accelerate to solar and wind, but also think about insulating our homes. So we need support from the government to insulate homes, to put in double glazing, to install the solar panels, to make sure there is onshore wind, to make sure we have the heat pumps, the district heating network. So this will cost money at the outset, but you know what? In the long term, it will save money in household bills. It will save money in business bills, but also it will help save the planet.
Some of these projects require sizable upfront costs. And this is coming at a time when government budgets are strained. I don't need to tell you that. Where will the money come from?
Let me give you an example why this makes huge economic sense. So the cost of air pollution, premature deaths, people taking time off work because of ill health, the cost to the health service is billions of pounds. So we save money there by reducing people going to hospital, taking time off work. The cost of congestion, because people drive in their car because the alternatives aren't as good, are humongous to the impact on productivity. The cost of climate change in relation to the floods, even in London, the floods in Germany, the heat waves in parts of the world, and forest fires are humongous. And so the cost actually is less of action than the cost of inaction. Let me tell you some work we've done in London. We worked out the cost to our city in 2020 of the fuel for our vehicles, fuel for keeping our buildings warm, the cost in relation to running our cars and transport system. That was £11 billion. Now we compare and contrast that cost in 2030 if electric vehicles were the norm, if our buildings were insulated, if we were using renewables, the cost was almost half. So actually, invested in this area saves money in the medium term as well as the long term, but also reduces the impact on people's lives in relation to asthma, cancer, heart disease, lung disease, taking time off work, but also creates jobs. Who's going to be making these heat pumps? Who's going to be installing these rapid charging points? Who's going to be making these electric vehicles? So these Green New Deals that mayors across the globe are doing, from London to Barcelona, from Dhaka to Freetown, these Green New Deals are using the awful pandemic as an opportunity to make sure we grow back greener.
Yeah, and that job part of it, I think, is key, and speaks to that opportunity that you mentioned as we try to deal with large number of youth and up and coming who are going to need those jobs and are going to need those modern economy jobs if they're going to thrive. Just a reminder to our viewers, we do hope to have a little bit of time at the end for some questions, so you can click the submit question button on your screen and go ahead and put them in, and we'll see if we can get them to the mayor. So, all of what you say is true, Mayor, but if you want electric vehicles, you have to have all the charging stations and the infrastructure for that. If you want to use solar, you have to have a way to augment that when weather's not cooperating, right? Again, these are big infrastructure projects. They're popular, but they have to be paid for. How do you get the private sector on board? What about public-private partnerships? How can you scale that? Is it incentives? Is it penalties? A mix of both? How can that help?
So you raise a really important and a profound point, the importance of the private sector playing its role. And you know what, the good businesses already are, the innovation, the ingenuity is going to come from the private sector, and the investment as well. And good businesses are already doing this. We in London have now divested away from fossil fuels in relation to our pensions, and across the globe, 18 mayors have done the same thing. That's $400 billion we're now invested in sustainable stuff and in innovation. And so we're working with the private sector. We're part funding some of the stuff. So in relation to, we've got an energy efficient fund, which we contribute towards. So does the private sector. We're doing work in relation to green finance to make sure that the venture capitalists, the angel investors, are thinking about solutions in relation to the 21st century. And we think cities can be the game changers because our citizens want this. Our citizens want to have cities that are green, that are sustainable, that are smart, where you've got, ultra fast broadband, meaning that people aren't traveling as much. We've got really good safe cycling. We've got the ability to have battery that stores the solar and stores the onshore wind. We in London have the largest number of electric buses of any city in the Western world. We've had to install the electric charging points, and we also have realized we've got a huge opportunity to change the market because we purchase the largest amount of energy of anybody in London. And so we can influence the market. And that's a game where the governments can step in relation to their purchasing power, in relation to the supply chain, in relation to our levers to incentivize investing in this area.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. And with the advent of remote work, some of which will stay with us, cities have to be competitive if people want to live there. They have to provide a quality of life that their citizens are going to want. Otherwise, they're going to go to the best in class. It's a new level of competition for cities, which should be an incentive.
Spot on. I went to London and the mega cities. In C40, there are 97 mega cities. We represent more than 700 million people. We're responsible for more than a quarter of the world's GDP. We know that in cities, the population tends to be more educated in terms of graduates, younger, more diverse, and we're competitive. So yes, we collaborate, but if we want people to move to our cities, we've got to recognize having toxic air is not going to attract people to our cities. Having jobs that aren't conducive to the 21st century aren't going to attract people to our cities. If you can't make cycling safe, don't expect people to cycle. If you haven't got wider pavements and decent air to breathe, don't expect people to walk and use active travel. If you've not got alternatives to the car in relation to decent public transport, don't expect people to commute by public transport. So that's the challenge for us, but I think it's an opportunity. And that's why it's really exciting, the work we're doing in C40, but also recognizing we can't do it alone. We need to be around the table. COP27 is an opportunity, but also this year in advance of the Egypt COP27, working with national governments to give us the powers and resources we need. We can be the problem solvers in this really important challenge we face.
Absolutely. We have a fantastic question from a viewer that I'd like to put to you. Does London have any plans to partner with other cities in developing nations such as Africa? I know this is something that you've really embraced as chair of C40. And for everyone in the audience, I think they do know that. But C40, of course, a group of mayors from 100 of the top leading cities around the world who are collaborating on climate. You are the chair of that right now. So what do you have in mind?
It's a really good question. Both in terms of micro London, we're seeing that climate justice is an issue of social justice and racial justice. It's the poorest Londoners, people of colour, least responsible, who face the worst consequences. And the same goes across, a macro level. The global south suffers far worse than the global north. So in the short term, in C40, since I've been chair, we've devoted more than 2/3 of our budget to the global south. We've scaled up, I explained Breathe London, having air quality monitors across London. We're now going Breathe Global. So we're giving these cities in the global south air quality monitors so their citizens can see how bad the air is. And so the mayors and leaders can get permission to have policies to address the toxic air. We're also working with great cities like Freetown in relation to, they've got a fantastic tree planting project, which helps in relation to landslides, but also in relation to supporting those communities fighting climate change, working with Accra in relation to the work they're doing around waste, working with North Dhaka in relation to the work they're doing in relation to sustainable water supplies for people moving to Dhaka. But the question is really important because I think we've got a responsibility in the global north, those with the broadest shoulders carrying the greatest burdens, but also we can provide leadership by showing how it can be done, but also supporting it in tangible terms, giving a helping hand to those in the global south.
And those who are in this fight know that if you cannot resolve it everywhere, we are not going to win. I mean, it has to take place in this coordinated fashion everywhere, so that no one's left out. We've seen how interconnected we all are. Do you worry heading into COP27? I feel like there was so much feeling of momentum and optimism coming out of COP26. Do you feel, or do you worry that countries are turning more inward as they try to deal with the economic and geopolitical challenges we face? Is that a worry?
It is a worry, but I think you can flip it, a sort of jiu-jitsu move, into an opportunity, because actually Ukraine necessitates urgency in relation to a move towards sustainable supplies of energy, wind, solar, geothermal, and so forth. I think the cost of living crisis around the globe, energy prices going up in the UK by more than 54%, inflation going up across the globe necessitates a cheaper supply of energy. The concerns with Russia necessitates us talking about security, and that's why sustainable forms of energy are really important. We're having greater urbanization, more and more people moving to the cities across the globe. That means that mayors and cities are going to be around the table. Look, in COP26, we saw great energy outside the conference room with young people, with the private sector, with the NGOs, with the mayors. What we saw inside the conference room was delay from our national leaders. And what we need is urgency from them as well. And if they're not willing to make the moves, step aside and allow mayors and cities, with the private sector, with our citizens, with the voluntary community sector, with the NGOs, for us to step up.
You mentioned the young people, and I think there's a group of stakeholders here who maybe we don't talk about often enough, and that is the public, the consumers, the citizens around the world. What lessons have you learned when it comes to messaging to the public and to your voters? Because on the one hand, you have those who worry that we're not moving fast enough, and I know you've been dealing with demonstrations in London recently on that front. And then on the other hand, there are those that worry if I get on board with the green revolution, it's going to cost me more. Somehow there's going to be difficulty, and I'm already facing skyrocketing bills. This economic environment does tend to make some more risk averse. How are you thinking about balancing that and trying to bring the public and the voters along with what you want to do?
This is a really important point for those of us who live in democracies, how we take people with us so we win bigger next time rather than losing elections because we failed to have a just transition and there have been too many losers. And we've got to do it differently to the previous industrial revolution in the 19th century. We've got to take people with us. And that's why it's really important for us to have a just transition, to have scrappage schemes to support people moving away from polluting vehicles, to make public transport more attractive, to explain why this is a now issue affecting you. So we, over the last 5 years, have educated Londoners about the premature deaths in London, more than 4,000 a year, about the impact on our health. Children have stunted lungs permanently because of the toxic air, the impact on health of those who are adults, from asthma to cancer, heart disease and lung disease, the cost to the NHS. You've got to educate people first. And that's why having the information, as you said, unless you measure it, you can't see it, you can't do it, is really, really important. And people aren't stupid. And I think one of the roles of good politicians is to be good educators and to teach people. It's that fine balance between leadership and followership. I worry too many national leaders are scared to educate the public, scared to take people with them. And that's why having targets 30 years down the road and are kicking this can 30 years down the road. I call them climate change delayers rather than climate change doers.
I love that. I always like to sort of end with a call to action. What would you like to see happening? That sense of urgency that we need, especially as everyone gears up to meet later in the year. What would you like to see?
The key thing for us is, in relation to cities, is to be in the room where it happens. Right? We need to be in the room where it happens. That means COP27 having a leading role for cities and mayors. Resilience and adaptations are going to be crucial. We're now seeing in global north cities flash floods, heat waves, people dying because of heat waves, businesses, homes being affected by flash floods. This is a now issue. That's why it's so important for cities and mayors to step up and for national governments to allow us to play a leading role. And at the same time, we really need the private sector to be, continue to be innovators, continue the ingenuity, continue to be partners in providing a solution to the challenge of climate change. I'm so hopeful, I'm so optimistic that we can, grapple with this. That's why it's important to be ambitious. I genuinely believe often our grasps should be bigger than our reach. And that's why we've got a zero carbon target for 2030. I think we're going to do it. We need support from our national governments to make sure we do it.
It is certainly the time to think boldly. Mayor Khan, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss the critical role that cities are playing and mayors can play at the nexus of climate change.
Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you so much. I feel energized after that, which is a perfect opportunity to introduce our next session that looks at power generation. Now, currently, power generation remains the largest emissions driver globally, accounting for over 40% of total emissions in 2019. Now, while renewables accounted for over 80% of new capacity installed worldwide that year, led by wind and solar PV, they still only account for 30% of global energy generation. With our next group of panelists, we will explore the role of zero emissions technology in portfolio diversification and the future of the grid. I am now pleased to welcome Dr. Sally Benson, Deputy Director for Energy and Chief Strategist for the Energy Transition, the White House, Ken Hartwick, President and CEO of Ontario Power Generation, and Maria Korsnick, President and CEO of Nuclear Energy Institute. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Sally, I'd like to begin the conversation with you. Let's sort of, go up a sort of 30,000 feet. What kind of zero emission energy sources are best suited to help both reduce emissions and strengthen the grid?
Well, so number one, from my vantage point here as the Deputy Director for Energy and the Chief Strategist for the Energy Transition, having clean, firm power is absolutely essential. And, clearly the cost of renewables has come down, which is fantastic. And we can imagine into the future getting a significant fraction of our electricity from those resources. But what we've learned from detailed modeling studies is that grids are going to be lower cost and are going to be more resilient and reliable if we also have some fraction of clean, firm power as part of the grid. And I think this is particularly important in the context, if we think about today, about 20% of our electricity, 20% of our end use energy, that means, when we use it, comes from electricity. And if we're going to be able to meet our climate commitments, that we are going to need to electrify cars, we're going to need to electrify heating and hot water, some parts of industry. So having a reliable and resilient electricity system is going to be more important than ever. So the Biden administration is making historic investments, including the recent $6 billion package that will make sure that our nuclear fleet continues to operate. But there are also very significant investments in other options for clean, firm power as well, including in hydrogen technology, $8 billion there, $10 billion for carbon capture, removal, and storage that can be used on electricity plants, as well as for industrial facilities, and $2.5 billion for nuclear reactors. So a lot is being done to advance the availability of a variety of options for clean, firm power. I'd just like to highlight one more that we've recently taken a closer look at, and that's fusion energy. And we can't do it on Earth today. It's what makes the sun so hot and so forth. But it turns out there have been a lot of recent advances in fusion technology as well. And we recently held a White House summit to look at what would it take to work with the private sector to advance these technologies. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's what gets exciting because there is all this fantastic innovation going on. Maria, I wonder, what's the sense of where we are from a technology point of view? Have things changed? Are some of these solutions scalable?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. And just to build on what Sally said, the government has really stepped in, and we have bipartisan support really for nuclear energy. And she mentioned in the bipartisan infrastructure package the $2.5 billion for advanced reactor development project. That's to bring 2 pilot projects online before this decade is out. And so absolutely, to your question, can these be scalable? Absolutely. And as she mentioned, what we really need is that firm carbon-free power. So we really want to partner with those intermittent sources of wind and solar. And we're sort of together, if you will, stronger, and the grid will be more resilient as well. And so one of the things, as we talk about advanced nuclear, in some cases, nuclear is going to get smaller, and some of these opportunities are small modular reactors or even micro reactors. And what's interesting about those is, these are things that can be constructed for the most part in a factory. And I think that gives a bit of an edge to taking some of the risk out of the construction side of these important projects. So a lot new going on in nuclear. It's a very exciting time.
Give us a little bit more information about taking the risk out. Is because they would be less capital intensive? Because why is that? Why is the ability to manufacture in a factory make it inherently less risky?
Yeah. So as we talk about small modular reactors, in fact, honestly, I wish we didn't call them small. I wish we called them simple modular reactors, because it's their simplicity, honestly, that gives it that sort of next step. Because as we've made them simpler, they require sort of fewer systems. And many of the larger components, if you will, can just be sort of factory built. It's modularized, can be constructed in the factory. Just think about that factory setting as opposed to sort of being stick built, if you will, on location. And so the fact that you can now construct these in a factory just gives you that much higher volume, as well as, higher quality control, and gives you the ability to construct these things, quite frankly, on the pace that we're going to need it. We polled our chief nuclear officers here in the United States and asked, as they look ahead between now and 2050, and the information we got back is, they're interested in just about as much power as we make today, 90 terawatts of power, additional power from nuclear between now and 2050. It's a lot of reactors.
Yeah, it is. And interesting what you're talking about, getting it to market quickly. I mean, we're talking about being able to scale it. Ken, I'd love for you to come in here, and you are one of the largest power producers in America. So, what is the state of play you see? What's happening in terms of accelerating zero emissions, and maybe what are some of the hurdles that you may be coming up against?
Sure. I think the starting point is really what is the size of the system that is needed to do all the things that Sally referenced? As far as if you're going to electrify and really clean up our transportation sector, building sector, industrial sector, you're probably looking at systems that are double the size they are now. And so some power systems in a particular province or state are already very carbon friendly. So in Ontario, for instance, we're 94% non-carbon emitting. But those other sectors I referenced are, obviously are where the bulk of the carbon is coming from. And every province and state has a different starting point. But the problem is immense. And I agree with the comments. It requires all forms of technology. I think for a number of years, people have been trying to look to solve the problem with one particular technology. I don't think that's the case. I think it requires solar, requires wind, it requires hydrogen, requires more hydroelectric, and requires nuclear that Maria was referencing, which I think is a really, really important point. In Ontario, for instance, we have a $12.8 billion project underway to refurbish one of our nuclear stations that will then be good for 30 more years. Bruce Power in Ontario has about a $13 billion project underway to refurbish theirs. And we've recently announced that we will look to build and bring online a simple modular reactor sometime in and around 28, 29. So we've picked the technology, we've picked the site, and are beginning the work in collaboration with others in the US as well to advance that. So I think it's important that we all recognize the size of the problem. It's not today's current system. That will not solve the problem that's created by electrification. It is much, much bigger. And that's why it's important that the planning that Sally and Maria referred to happens, because this is a very broad, complex, but solvable problem on the GHG side.
I like that you say solvable. Anytime we're having any of these conversations, I like to hear the word solvable. Just a reminder, we do have some questions coming in. If you would like to ask one, we are going to try to get to some. Go ahead and click that ask a question button and you can submit it, and we'll try to get to it. Sally, I think that Ken brought up a great point in that, in the past, people would kind of try to pick the winning horse, right? Or it seemed a very binary conversation. We have to leave this and choose this, and this will bring us into the future. As someone who's managing the transition, how are you messaging multiple solutions, and how do you get bipartisan support for that? Because I would imagine, depending on who you're working with and the state you're working with, people have a preference for one over the other. How are you addressing that challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's so remarkable is, had you asked that question 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago, you would have gotten an entirely different answer, because people really couldn't imagine that we could run a grid that's like the grids that are being operated today. So, beginning, 2005 or so, we began to see the scale up of wind power first, and then solar power. And the grid operators were really handed a challenge. It's because they were used to resources that they could turn them on and off whenever they needed them, and they were actually brilliant at doing that. And all of a sudden they were handed a different set of resources that were, very variable and dependent on the weather and the time of the day and the season of the year and so forth. And what has happened is they've done a remarkably good job of figuring out how to integrate these resources. So I think that's sort of where we are now. We've gained experience, but really the key question is, as we go through this evolution where we move towards a zero emission grid, how do we figure out how to operate these? And it turns out a whole suite of sophisticated models are now developed. They're called, for geeks here, for capacity expansion and dispatch models. And they actually allow you to model, weather dependent and daytime, time of day dependent energy resources, and then figure out what is the lowest cost way to integrate those with other resources like clean firm resources or hydrogen. And so we actually know a lot about how to do this from a perspective of reducing cost. And interestingly, what we do find is that having a really diverse mix gives you the most lowest cost power. Because solar and wind are really inexpensive today, right? So if you can use as much of those as you can, but then make sure we still have that reliability and resilience because of clean, firm power, you can, kind of find the Goldilocks sweet spot for how to do that. But certainly solar, wind, batteries, natural gas with CCS, nuclear, geothermal, hydropower, all of these taken together. And just one final thought. So we did some very detailed studies in California in particular, and found out that the more diverse your supply of resources was, actually the lower that got you to the lowest cost mix. And it made it so all those assets were operated most efficiently, meaning that if you put an asset on the grid, it could operate as much as it possibly could and generate all those revenues, so that they would be even better investments if you had a more diverse supply.
I think that's so important to bring up, because in this conversation, we're talking about, some of it used to be talked about through an environmental lens only. I'm hearing you say that it's more cost efficient and also more reliable. I mean, we know the issues of reliability have been front page news with severe heat, whether you're talking about Texas or issues with flooding. Does it check all these boxes? And is that part of the sort of change in tone that you're hearing?
Yeah, I think absolutely that. I think there's a very solid case for diversity of supply. Of course, we need all the appropriate hardening so that, we're equipped to deal with weather extremes. In parts of the world, they're also having to be equipped to deal with large scale fires, which can also make it so that certain portions of the grid are not accessible. So we have a lot of hardening to do to get that reliability, but certainly that diversification gives you a lot of benefits.
Yeah, redundancies, we'd call them in the corporate world, that you make sure that you have multiple sources that you can turn to. Maria, at the risk of stating the obvious, what's this public sentiment around nuclear right now? I mean, this has had a sort of checkered past, and public sentiment has not always been in favor of this. Where are we with that?
Actually, I would say nuclear is really enjoying some very positive public sentiment, maybe over the last several years. And I think sort of building on what Sally said, I think people are really trying to appreciate, how are we going to get here? They appreciate that there's climate things happening. They appreciate that a solution is needed. And I think people are stepping back and saying, well, wait a minute, how do we really get there? And as Sally said, I think it's a bit of an all of the above. Sort of anybody that can produce something carbon free, sort of needs to have a footprint here. And yeah, I'll be honest, nuclear isn't normally one that wins necessarily a popularity contest, but honestly, we are having more of those conversations. I'll point to Wyoming as an example. They were looking to site a nuclear plant in Wyoming at an existing coal facility, and they had 4 different towns that were really vying for this power plant to be built in their area. And so, the fact that we have, several different towns sort of vying over getting the siting of a nuclear plant, I think that's an example of the fact that, nuclear is really sort of embracing kind of a resurgence, if you will, in positive attention. And it's not just here in the United States. Ken mentioned what they're seeing already in Canada, but it's in Europe as well, and other places around the world. And so I think, again, a collective reckoning of what it's actually going to take to go carbon free. We're also seeing it at the state level. If 5 years ago, I would have told you that there was, 10 or 12 bills that had anything to do with nuclear running around in state legislatures, that would have been significant. And I would tell you today, there's over 100. And you have some, pretty predominantly coal states like West Virginia and Montana, really taking a strong positive view of nuclear. West Virginia, as an example, just overturned their moratorium on building new nuclear. So a lot of very positive signals of states as well as the federal government really signaling, let's take a look at nuclear for what it offers. And it's really that highly reliable carbon-free power. Our nuclear fleet today has had a greater than 90% capacity factor for over 2 decades. Very strong performance.
And we certainly know, I think, Ken, as you pointed out, demand is going up, whether it's crypto miners in Wyoming or, electric vehicles and Teslas, which are everywhere, and everyone else who's planning to roll out their electric vehicles. The demand is off the charts. We know that there's going to be increased strain on the power grids, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. Ken, are you able to sort of implement these technologies as quickly as you would like in terms of licensing, in terms of regulation?
So the answer to that is perhaps, which is not really a good answer, by the way. But I think if we look at our site where we're going to build a new SMR, we already had an environmental assessment done. It was done a few years ago. So we have that in hand. So it's a relatively straightforward process to go through the public consultation, to go through the technical licensing, and then the construction, which is why we're sort of targeting to 28. But and again, this is very dependent on the state, on the province. If you have to start at an environmental assessment process, and the Canadian one, and whether you're building a nuclear plant or a mine, is probably a 6-7 year process, which is long. So you tack that on the front end of what you want to do. And I think that's where the work is required, led by federal governments around the world, to say, how do we be constructive in doing those environmental assessments? How do we build in public consultation to shorten that front end? Because the problem is climate change and emissions. So if we take too long to do that front end piece of work, we're just going to miss every target. And I think that's what my sense of politicians, I think, are coming to that realization that the problem is urgent. And therefore, we have to look at how we shorten some of those cycles so that we can more quickly address a problem. And I often say, if the target is to be carbon neutral by 2050, and you think you're going to do it all in 2049, we're going to miss. So a big chunk of this needs to be done at the front, because the last 10% is really, really hard. And so I'd say that's the urgency. And just to pick up on your earlier comment around support for nuclear, one of the things that has really developed over the last couple of years is the types of people who are supporting nuclear. And it's always been great, nuclear engineers and others in the industry, we always thought it was a good idea. But when you start having people come out like Bezos, like Musk, like people like this, who are very influential, whether you like them or not, that's a different story, but are very influential across people that they touch on, and they start to say nuclear is required, it builds that younger generation into opening their mind to say, oh, maybe it is required. And I agree with Maria, like our project to build a new plant out just east of Toronto has very, very high public support. And that's, I think, part of it.
That's so interesting. I got to ask you this question because it's so specific to Canada, and let me know if you can't answer it. But Jonathan from Coburg is asking, how might rural communities leverage the green button standard to adapt to climate change? Ontario just mandated this standard for our 59 utilities to implement by November 1st, 2022. Are you familiar with that? And please enlighten the rest of us, because I myself do not know what the green button standard is.
Yeah, that is very specific to Ontario and Canada, but the concept is very general across the US, into Europe, elsewhere. But really the green button standard is really just looking at, and we have 59 utilities, local distribution companies within Ontario, so probably more than what most are used to. But it does start to give them the standard so a customer can look and basically see how is what I'm doing at my house or say small business, how is that impacting from an environmental standpoint and the usage that I have from my system. So it's really building a information network that gives the customer more direct visibility. And I think this was, I think, Sally's point right at the beginning. The more transparency we can have to everybody, the more likely it is we can alter a habit, change a habit, or do something along that lines. And that's really what the standard is looking to do, is make it a really open platform. So me as a consumer can look at my hydro bill, can look at how that's impacting what it's using on the grid, and then for what I might do. So it's really just a tool, a consumer tool.
Yeah, but it's so critical, right? And I think the mayor touched on this when they also implemented and just gathered all this data so they could show people what the air quality was. We have a question, Sally, from Rebecca. What efforts are industries and governments taking to educate the public about the need to transition, the magnitude of the change, and the benefits to them individually? And this matters when you're talking about facing election and re-election, and the mayor again touched on that. You've got to lead, but you got to stay in office in order to do it and execute your plans. How important is that education outreach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from day one with the Biden-Harris administration, they rejoined the UNFCCC process, the Conference of the Parties, to contribute to understanding what we could contribute to carbon emission reductions. Very, very clear about that. Made commitments to 50 to 52% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050, by 2030, net zero by 2050. So I think it starts with the top of, okay, here's directionally where we're going. There's also a tremendous amount of engagement with communities across the country, talking about the kind of opportunities from having cleaner electricity, also the opportunities for electrification, for again going back to transportation and heating, and also a lot of work with energy communities that have historically provided the energy that we relied on and still rely on today, to finding transition pathways where you have new industries that are skills matched, but that can provide similar services that are decarbonized. So I think it's really a multi-level engagement, all the way from communities to a strong statement from the top that we're in this, we're committed to those emissions reductions, and if we're going to be able to stabilize climate, the United States needs to be a leader in that.
Mm. And that question, by the way, if I didn't mention it, was from Rebecca from RWR Consultants in Chicago. Maria, we also have a question from Shamadas, if I'm saying that right, hopefully from Arlington, Virginia. Can you talk about safety improvements in nuclear power station operations? What are the key vulnerabilities and what can be done to address these weak points?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, the plants that we operate today are very safe, and I think you can look from the track record that we have. And these reactors that we're talking about of the future, these more simple modular reactors, are even safer. And one of the reasons that is because they actually count on fewer active components. They're thinking passive safety. So what do I mean by that? Like today, for example, you would have pumps that are in operation in order to circulate your coolant around your reactor. And some of these reactors of the future, you're just going to count on natural circulation. So there's no pumps. And so that's just like one example of, instead of waiting or crediting something of an active nature, you're really just counting on physics, if you will, and gravity, to operate these. And so what that helps with, as well as, in some cases, they use the term sort of walk away safe. In other words, there's really sort of no operator action that's required to shut anything down or to shut the reaction down. So I use that as an example for the reactors that we see coming in these advanced reactors. But I just want to reinforce, the current fleet that we have has a very strong operating record. And I personally was an operator at a plant, and I was a site vice president that ran a plant and a chief nuclear officer that ran several plants. And, we have an excellent network of not only good designs here in the United States, but also a good network of the operators of these power plants.
Which is really critical. I mean, you're talking about, skill-based and increasingly high level, highly technical skilled labor that's needed for that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Ken, included in this climate conversation is the need to make sure the transition is just. Sally just mentioned engaging communities that are traditionally, energy or based where facilities are located. What are you doing at OPG? I know this is an issue you're focused on. What are you doing to make sure that local communities have a voice and are engaged, especially low-income communities who may be impacted either by virtue of the fact that they're geographically located where the infrastructure is, or for the fact that they're often left out and maybe not participating in access to affordable energy?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of elements to this. The first one, obviously, any type of transition, whether it's energy or others, tends to disadvantage groups on the way through that transition. Now, some of it very unintentional, some of it, just has to be by the very nature of it. But I think it's the importance, and I think the mayor touched on this a little bit earlier, is the importance is to recognize where that disadvantaged group or groups are, because that's where I think both the utilities, but government policy can play a role by recognizing who the transition might hurt on the way through to a different result, and how do you bridge that so that you don't leave a community, a city, a group of people behind in the transition. Because it's again, I think the early parts of energy transition was let's just rush to clean up, let's rush to do things. And you're right, it does impact certain individuals. And I can give you the Ontario story. So when we closed our last coal plant in 2014, it was done very quickly. And we transitioned mostly to renewables, so to wind and solar. It resulted, if you were in a rural community, your power bill went up by about 40%. If you lived in a big, dense city like Toronto or one of the other bigger cities, your power bill went up 6, 7, 8%. And that's just a law of numbers. So if you're not paying attention, if you live in rural Ontario and you work on a farm, or you have a farm and your bill goes up by 40%, you're now severely disadvantaged. But I think what I see with governments now is they're in tune with this issue. They recognize that a bigger city like New York has more people to spread something over. You get a lower impact. You go into farming in Idaho, you have to think differently. And so, but we have to be aware of that throughout the transition so we don't leave people behind. The other part, I think, is, and you hear this a lot around the jobs. And I think we have a great opportunity again here to retrain, reskill, and reset people into what is now a more complex energy grid, energy system that needs to double in size. But again, that needs to be a very proactive step by businesses like ours and others, and then by government policy. And again, what we see in Ontario is we are working with the Ontario government and our federal government on this transition of the skills of tomorrow. So we don't have it figured out, but the fact that we have a program working on it gives you a lot of hope that you get there. But the point is a great one. We cannot leave 30% of the population behind on the transition. We have to bring them along with us and ensure that their economic situation is not impacted as we head towards doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And that has to happen at a local, state level, national level, but also globally, as we were talking about in C40 in the global South and developing nations as well. Sally, we have quite a technical question, but I have a feeling you'll be able to field it. This is coming from Valerie in Menlo Park, the nucleation capital. We are currently using natural gas as a dispatch energy source for intermittent renewables. When are we going to switch to an abundancy model where we dispatch a mix of special climate services like hydrogen production or carbon capture when clean excess power is available, with the goal of balancing the grid without having to curtail any source of clean energy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think that there's an answer, a definitive answer now. When we, number one, having more technologies available. So for example, renewable natural gas is now, this is gas produced typically from farming or livestock operations. So that's now available, and it gives you a carbon neutral source of energy. So when we get there depends on when we have additional assets that we can integrate into the grid. We need to think about markets very carefully, because right now, if there's excess renewables, they'll be curtailed. There are some generating units that actually have to operate at a negative cost because they're producing more power than the grid would really like to accommodate. So having an information system that would allow you to match excess generation to people who can use those resources, say for hydrogen production, is going to be key to that. However, having said that, there's a lot of excitement about using intermittent power sources for doing things like making hydrogen or doing other valuable energy services. One of the challenges is if you have a piece of equipment that you bought, like an electrolyzer for making hydrogen, and if you're not operating that 24/7, or at least with a very high capacity factor, it's hard to make the economics of that work. So we're going to have to think carefully about how do we create markets where we can utilize all of our assets very efficiently, because if we don't, it's going to cost us more than it needs to.
Yeah, great point, Sally. And Marie, this makes me, every time we have this conversation, it makes me think of I know implementation is going to be a big theme for COP27. And it's this sort of skeletal infrastructure that needs to be put into place to get the technology in the innovation, which sounds like it's there or increasing rapidly, to a state where it can be efficiently applied to get to the goals of 2030 and 2050, but also make sure it makes economic sense to all the stakeholders. I wonder, there are trillions of dollars of private investment dollars earmarked for climate, for things just like this. How, what are you seeing in terms of steering funds to the projects that so desperately need them? I mean, when you're talking about creating markets, the private sector has been doing this forever and very good at it. How do you match up the money and the skill set?
Yeah, thanks. And that's actually a focus area for us to really, take the financial sector and sort of connect it to the nuclear sector, because nuclear for so long has been large reactors and huge projects and things that take several years. Now we have a nuclear that's far more approachable. It's smaller chunks of capital investment. It can be built faster, much of it in a factory, as we said, deployed more quickly. And so we need to make sure that that's understood by the financial sector to appreciate how that investment can quickly be turned into something that's deployable. And the other thing is, when we talk about getting more efficient, it's when you kind of get to nth of a kind. You've built something several times, so you're good at it, you're confident in it. Well, this is a great example of how we're partnering with Ken and his organization. So he wants to build a certain make and model. Well, we want to build the same make and model here in the United States. And you know what? Poland wants to build some of the same thing. So in a relatively short period of time, we can get to nth of a kind, because we're going to get that experience very quickly. And I think that's what's going to be something that we can all sort of see over the next few years. A beautiful innovation pipeline from the United States, many of our national labs, that is now going to be coming to the market. And actually, I think the financial sector is sort of being very well received of this conversation around nuclear.
Yeah, I have certainly talked to many on the investment side, and there is this desire to see to find those projects. It's just meeting them, believe it or not, matching them up. I mean, just getting the intelligence, how to manage the risk, how to understand this. And I know everyone's working to accelerate that, but anything that can be done in that area, I think will be able to unlock a lot. Ken, question for you from Amina, S&P Global Commodity Insights. What changes has Ontario made to handle the influx of EVs and the intermittency of renewables into its grid? What is OPG doing to handle these loads that don't follow traditional peak off, peak load models? Great question.
Yes, so it sort of builds a little bit on the question earlier that Sally had, but on the EV adoption rate, and the way I typically get asked the question is, if everyone bought an EV tomorrow, would the grid work? The short answer is no. The grids have not been built, especially in cities, for heavy adoption. So I think there's catching up to do there. And Ontario is probably in the 5-6% range as far as EV adoption, but it's accelerating. Our federal government has a program to get to 30% by 2026 and then more after that. But the intermittency is a really good point because, again, if you go to Ontario, we have about 4,000 megawatts of wind installed in the province. On hot days, about 100 of it runs. To put it in perspective, we're not beside an ocean and we don't have mountains, so it's a very low factor. And but what we I think have done very effectively is we have the big nuclear plants that are base load, have the good fortune of having a very robust hydroelectric system that allows you to utilize water, which gives you flexibility. And then have gas plants, which are really used for grid stabilization and peaking purposes. And so again, sometimes it's as much luck allows you to operate the system a certain way as it is, maybe even good planning. And I think we have the fortune of having a little bit of both. So it's allowed us to move down the pace pretty well with solar, with wind, with batteries, these types of things that require the base load assets. But I agree, eventually gas plants are going to go the same direction as coal plants, where they're going to have to be clean gas. It's going to have to be hydrogen blended in order for them to remain relevant. And that's why we like the investment on the nuclear side, because we think it ticks all the boxes along with the other technologies to provide that stability back to whatever your starting point for your grid might be.
Sally, that's a great setup for this next question from Ethan Guidehouse in Chicago. Can an all of the above energy approach exclude coal, but maintain natural gas and still meet climate goals?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, it's can we have a gas plus renewables grid? Is that?
I think so. I think if we keep gas in the equation, include everything else you've all been talking about, just carve out coal, can we still meet climate goals? Or I guess the unsaid in that is, do we need an element of fossil fuels in there as well in the transition to meet the 2030 or 2050? And Ethan, I hope if I'm paraphrasing that we captured what you were going after, but is the mix there to achieve the goals? Are we just lacking the political will and the implementation, or do we also need more on the energy source?
I think we know quite clearly that we could run a grid with the combination of clean, firm resources and renewable powers and batteries that we have today. Coal, in some parts of the country, coal is still very important as a power source, but there are substitutes. But looking to the long term, yes, it's easy to imagine in the United States a coal-free grid. In certain parts of the country, natural gas plus carbon capture and storage may make a tremendous amount of sense in the long run, but it could also be hydrogen. Yes, a mix that includes natural gas plus other things, I think, is a very feasible pathway to get to net zero.
And Sally, very quickly, Maria mentioned the bipartisan support. Do you also feel sometimes, looking at the headlines, it doesn't feel that way, but do you feel there's increasingly bipartisan support to implement this and get the legislation passed that's needed?
Yeah, I the people that I interact with include a broad, cross-section of the energy industry and the environmental community. And I think we all know where we're going, and we need to get there quickly. And we just need to find a way to de-risk these new technologies. And de-risking means not only the technology, but the regulatory issues, permitting to be able to construct things predictably, and also markets that make it predictable, how often and under what conditions you'll be operating your generation.
We've got to leave it there. So appreciative of all of your time, Dr. Sally Benson, Ken Hardwick, and Maria Korsnick. Thank you so much. Great conversation. And it is my pleasure to welcome back Allison Carlson to share where our climate journey continues. Allison.
Hi, Maggie. Thanks so much for those two great and very important conversations. I'm really learning a lot. So before diving back into the program, I'd like to take this opportunity to point out the wealth of content from foreign policy and also foreign policy analytics on the important topics that we're discussing today at the summit. If you're logged into our event portal, there's a list of articles and reports below the video player that we're adding to throughout both days to supplement the conversation. So please check those out, and we'll send some of those links as well after the event. And also a quick reminder, we want to bring in as many questions as possible throughout the course of the 2 days. So please take a look at the Q&A button to the left of your screen and submit those questions, and we'll address as many as we can live. So thank you again to everyone for tuning in, and now back to our program. So as we just heard, we need a range of technologies to transition to net zero, and ones that can really drive deep decarbonization. To specifically address the role of nuclear, which I know we touched on in the last panel, but to dive a little bit deeper into that technology specifically, I recently spoke with Rafael Mariano Grossi, who's the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I began the discussion by asking him how nuclear energy can be part of a portfolio approach to reduce emissions and contribute to energy security and reliability. Let's take a listen.
Well, indeed, this has been a discussion and an evolution in the discussion, which is finally going in the right direction. Those working in nuclear industry or nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear writ large have known for a long time that in order to get us to a decarbonized economy, global economy, which would be at the level required for sustained growth, betting on just one source of energy, in this case renewables, of course, albeit in its different varieties, would simply not make it. And it's not a matter of ideology or a preference. It's a simple conclusion driven by years of experience on the need to ensure baseline power and also being able to have stable grids and many other factors which are well known for energy specialists all over the world. So when looking into the future, when looking at the market right now, when looking at the levels of emissions that we are sustaining, even now, you were rightly mentioning the latest IPCC report, which, by the way, mentions nuclear explicitly now. In the past, there were other more tangential, if you wish, references to nuclear because of ideological or other prejudice on it. I think that now it's very clear that those who need to get there, ensuring the convergence of these equally important objectives, decarbonization and sustained economic growth, nuclear has already a place at the table, I would say. It's not a matter of realizing a promise. It's sustaining what we have, which is already very, very important, 12, 13% of what we have, right now, and of course much higher when you go down in the analysis to industrialized economies, where you range from the 20% in the United States to the almost 75 or 80% in countries like France and many others with equally important shares of nuclear energy in the grid. So all of this makes it for a convergence of needs and also availability of nuclear to play this role, which for us is of course self-evident, but one has to do it. Yes.
Absolutely. And you mentioned industrialized countries and significant shares of nuclear energy contributing to France's power generation, for example. What about developing countries, and what are the challenges and opportunities to deploy greater nuclear generation there?
Well, that is very, very interesting, because you have a good number of countries. I would describe those as part already of the emerging countries in the South or in the developing world, in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and others as well. Of course, India is there, has been there for a long time, Pakistan. And now we are seeing other countries being added to the list. What I see, for example, from my own personal perspective, as Director General of the IEA, an international organization with 173 members, of course, the vast majority developing countries, hardly a week passes without me receiving a Minister of Energy who is telling me, we want small modular reactors. We want to be part of that. We know that at a relatively affordable price, now nuclear can be integrated into our grid. So one can see a clear trend in that direction. Of course, these things need to be consolidated in the future. We've seen in the past that announcements were made which were not followed through. But the big difference now is that they are aiming or looking at something which is different in terms of the availability or the possibility for a developing economy to have it. When you're talking about a reactor at the range of $500 million, there's a big difference with a big nuclear power plant in the range of 5 billion as opposed to millions. So it is obvious the attraction of that in the market is quite evident, and maybe we can discuss about this on the SMRs specifically. But what I see is a very clear indication of a growing number of developing economies in Asia, in Africa, and others as well in Latin America, apart from those who are already consolidated nuclear users.
Absolutely. I'd like to follow up on 2 points that you just made. And if you could speak a little bit more to advancements in technology and what are advanced nuclear reactors and the modularity associated with that can facilitate greater deployment as a first part of the question. And a second part of the question being about financing. Understandably, these projects require significant upfront investment and capital requirements. And so, yes, the costs are being brought down, but how can these types of projects be more readily deployed in developing markets, and what financing mechanisms are needed?
Well, in terms of of technology and design, I think we are looking at a real change in terms of what these reactors suppose and how they are going to be developed. Basically, a small modular is a reactor that could be used in units in isolation or combined with added units in the range of from 30 megawatts to 100 or more, adding, as I say, modularity in units that could be produced at a different place from where the reactor is actually going to be deployed or operating. So this in itself is a big difference in the sense that you could envisage an evolution of a market where you can practically import in segments your reactor, significantly reducing the need for technological or infrastructural bases that in some countries may be limited. Not in others, but in some countries, the ability to have large metallurgical production lines is more of a challenge than in other parts. Of course, the capital investment in a model like this is easier to be financed, either by companies themselves or with the support of the state. In the case of the United States, we are seeing right now evolution in this sense, and some companies are already clinching deals and pre-deals, in particular in Eastern Europe, that you may be aware of, to deploy reactors. In the case of the United Kingdom, it is again the same thing, and we see the British government also committing funds for this purpose. Remains to be seen whether international finance institutions would be open to this. It has been the tradition not to. Nuclear has been notably being excluded from international funding for a number of reasons. But it is not to be excluded that this may also evolve. What we have seen, let me tell you, and I think it's quite interesting, is a change in attitudes and predisposition to nuclear in quite a short period of time. We've seen this in Europe as well, where after long debates, the European institutions, I don't want to get into technicalities, they have included nuclear projects as projects that could be considered sustainable and therefore financeable. So all of this, which was completely out of the table before, is something which, if it's not a game changer, is quite similar, because now investors, institutional investors, private investors can also add to their portfolios these types of projects.
Great, thank you, and all very, very important. And something that I have to raise based on the moment that we're in, and something that has been in the spotlight as of late, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the attack on the nuclear power station. So what should our audience, which includes policymakers, investors, and the general public, know about the safety and security of nuclear projects, and what should be considered when looking at them as part of an energy security strategy?
Well, indeed, it's a very relevant point, and one where I myself and the IAEA are deeply involved, working in trying to ensure that in spite of these tragic circumstances in Ukraine, the nuclear facilities are protected. I've been there a couple of times already, and we are working very hard to ensure the physical integrity of all these facilities. We did have an episode in one of these stations, Zaporizhia, where there was an episode of violence, an attack on one administrative building close to a reactor. And in my role as Director General of the IAEA, I have been, as I should, talking to all sides, including Russia, in order to make very clear this message that nuclear facilities, of course, should never be attacked or in any way compromised in their activities. But let me say that on occasions similar to this one, to this conversation that we are having now, on interviews with the international media, I have been asked, well, look at what's going on with the war there. Should then people reconsider nuclear. And my answer is very clear. The problem is the war, not nuclear activities per se, and a war or armed conflict, of course, can compromise any piece of the national infrastructure of a country, from distilleries, refineries, chemical installations, which may cause equally negative environmental damage. So what we say here is that what we are seeing is quite unique, unprecedented in its characteristics. And the issue is, of course, to keep nuclear power installations or associated facilities protected. And the agency has been able to contribute to that. The IAEA has been able to contribute to that. Of course, we're still, unfortunately, as we speak, we are still in the midst of this conflict. But I believe there is a clear notion and acceptance that a nuclear attack on an attack on a nuclear facility would be completely unacceptable, condemned internationally, and of course would merit no sympathy whatsoever. So what we need to do is to be able to work. We are there. The IAEA inspectors are present, are moving and working with the Ukrainian authorities to give this protection to the plants.
One last question for you before we need to wrap up today is related to waste. And you mentioned game changers before. And I know there are several projects around the world, one in Finland, for example, where there have been strategies to deal with spent fuel that are considered game changers. And so just wondering if you could speak to that and what innovations are happening on that front that are enabling expansion of nuclear fleets around the world.
Well, in all consolidated nuclear countries, including the United States, the issue of waste management and waste disposition, final disposition, or other back-end strategies have been discussed for many, many years. And I would say the issue here, not unlike what has happened with nuclear energy in general, problems have been more associated to issues of social and political acceptability rather than technological solutions being or not being available. You mentioned Finland. I had the opportunity and the privilege to go and visit Onkalo, which is almost finished. Even as IAEA, we are working already on the safeguarding of the place. And this deep geological repository is almost finalized. Sweden is going in the same direction, and so are other countries. So for me, what is crucial is to have an open, transparent discussion at societal level, and to give the necessary information so that population, like in Onkalo or in Forsmark in Sweden, are actually demanding these facilities because they provide highly paid jobs. They provide economic activity in places that were otherwise, I would say, less dynamic. So instead of seeing in these risks, I see opportunity because all of these projects are sustained by a very sound scientific and technological base. Once you have the right information there in terms of the stability of the geological space, which in all of the cases goes much higher and longer than the planned activity of the waste, then you know you are in safe hands, and that you can dispose of this nuclear waste in a very safe way. And let me say again that information and possibilities like this that we are having is so important, because when people talk about waste, sometimes the perceptions are deformed by misinformation or misconceptions. people ignore that more than 60 years of safe and clean nuclear energy in the United States result in waste that could fill a baseball stadium, and that would be all. So the physical imprint of nuclear energy, including waste, is so environmentally friendly in terms of not occupying space, not invading space as other sources of energy, and doing it under constant supervision, which is another important element. Not all energy sources have such a developed and thick institutional set of norms to control what happens with the waste and to finance it. A nuclear project typically includes the cost of the treatment and the disposition of waste. It is not the case with other types of energies. Nuclear waste is safeguarded by us, by the IAEA. So there is a constant, a permanent process of monitoring, if you want. So my impression is that this is an issue for which the technological solutions do exist. We need to align our activities in a way that they gain public acceptance. And as we have seen in other countries, this is absolutely possible. This is not a mission impossible.
Unfortunately, we need to wrap it up. But again, Rafael Mariano Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, thank you so much for being with us today. We really
thank you.
appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My name is Reena Nine, and we're going to pick up this conversation based on our earlier discussion with Mayor Khan and dig deeper into sustainability strategies for cities. You know, over 3.5 billion people currently live in cities. That's about 60 to 80% of today's energy consumption. So how can we look at these cities? How can we look at these companies around the world and strategize to create better and greener infrastructure? Joining me today, we're going to have the perspective from C40 and mayors and industry leaders on the front line.
Using bicycles as a means of transport, particularly for those most vulnerable. Our weather is decent enough so that can actually be a decent bet for a lot of the population. So I think that's where we started. We're way behind on our metro system, but that doesn't have a subway. We're building our first subway. So it's been relatively easy for us to go forward with the electrification of our bus system. We've been head to head with Santiago de Chile in terms of being the city outside of China with the most electric buses. We'll have around 1,500 of them circulating in the city by the end of this year. And that's been a big bet that's been going on for around 15 years since Bogota made a bet on a bus rapid transit system, which is one of the first ones in the world to be quite as successful and as big. So I think those are two main issues. And we've put forward, probably in a very significant way in terms of cities our size in Latin America, in terms of thinking of land use planning and thinking of our master land use plan as an opportunity to think about climate in a new way. And that's, first of all, trying to build for an 8 to 10 million people city. It's a tough bet, but we're betting on a 30-minute city to make sure that all our services and all the essential activities that any citizen in Bogota has to endeavor in their daily life, for that to be 30 minutes away. And that's the way we thought of the land use plan that we put forward to the City Council in December this year. Mostly looking to new means of transport, electrifying our transport, making a big bet on regional trains, which we don't have in Bogota, and building not only 5 metro lines, but 6 cable cars. Bogota, like many Latin American cities, is built across a mountain system, and our most vulnerable segments of our population live high up in the mountains. Cables are really a significant means of giving equality, an opportunity through the transport sector. And I think that's also a very interesting way which we've thought of transport. It's not only getting from one place to another, but really planning our transport, of course, in a clean way, but thinking about how it joins people with opportunities. in thinking of transport, not only in terms of what the studies tell us now, but what they tell us over the next 50 years. And I think that's generally what's been our bet in terms of climate and transport specifically.
Honey, on that point that Secretary Urrutia was making about what will stick, what do you find when it comes to trying to reduce emissions and energy consumption from buildings and the environment around us? What are the behaviors that you have seen that tend to stick?
You know, there's been 5 key trends that are shaping our cities in terms of smart cities and in terms of some of these behaviors that we're trying to see more of. On one hand, we have connectivity of people, vehicles, infrastructure, devices, and so on. And what that means is that we have a lot of data that is coming in on the status of those different infrastructures, devices, and so on. And through data, we're able to, of course, operate systems more efficiently, but also we're able to influence behavior. We're able to influence behavior towards greener alternatives, for example, by, again, displaying some of that information, providing incentives on a real-time basis, and so on. So in addition to connectivity, looking a little further ahead, we're looking at automation as potentially giving us an opportunity to, again, create more efficiencies in the operation of our systems. We're also looking at more generally trends related to the shared economy, sharing of vehicles, shared mobility in general, of course, and of course our colleague from Uber is going to be discussing that, a much better place to talk about that than I am. The fourth one is electrification, and the Secretary alluded to that. And when we talk about automation, the sweet spot is that at the same time that we're introducing this automation, we're also leveraging that to introduce electric vehicles along with connected vehicles and connected systems. And the fifth one that the Secretary has also mentioned is really micromobility. And we're seeing a lot of micromobility. Now, the pandemic has been an interesting, of course, a dramatic natural experiment in many ways. And we've seen behaviors that we would like to continue seeing, like more remote work, for example, that will tend to reduce the impact of everyday commuting. Okay, but at the same time, we're seeing some negative aspects because some people have figured, well, if I can work remotely, then maybe I can live further away. We've also seen a negative impact on public transportation, and that's been also an issue that that's been recovering. But a good behavior that we've seen is more people walking and more people relying on micromobility. And so we're hoping that some of these behaviors are going to stick. And when you couple these various elements with some of the policy changes that are underfoot, there's hope in that direction.
On that point about the carbon footprint also that you mentioned earlier, Adam, I want to turn to you. I know you're with Uber, but when you think of a ride-hailing company, there is a significant carbon footprint there. What are ways that Uber's innovating that people might not really know?
Thanks, Rena, for the question, and so good to join all of you. It's an honor to be with you, Carolina and Hani, and thanks for having us on. So I'm Adam Gross. I lead on sustainability policy at Uber and have done for about 5 years. And interestingly enough, Rena, when I've worked on climate and transportation for my whole career since the early 2000s, when I took a job with the California Air Resources Board after getting an engineering degree, and caught the electric vehicle bug really, really early. My folks thought I was working for a golf cart company or something back in 2001. This is pre-Tesla, right? And I remember when Uber came along, I was living in Brooklyn, and I was very skeptical that this type of service was needed. We had all the tools. We had public transportation. We had active modes. We had electric vehicles. But I remember after moving to San Francisco several years ago, I needed to get somewhere fast and was in a pinch, couldn't take public transit, and the cabs weren't coming. So I had downloaded Uber on a whim, pressed a button, and it just so turned out that a Tesla Model X was delivered. Like I was randomly upgraded, and it showed up, and the doors went up like this, like a DeLorean. And here it was, an electric vehicle at the push of a button. And I thought, wait a minute, I've kind of missed this. And it goes back to what Hani mentioned in terms of that connectivity, and what Carolina mentioned in terms of connection with opportunity. So not only was I pushing a button, accessing a clean ride in an EV, which was the first time I'd ever been in a Tesla, like that, certainly a Model X. And here I was getting an exposure to it through a simple push of a button in a fairly affordable ride. But also that driver was earning an opportunity by giving me that ride. And it was another average citizen utilizing their vehicle more, spreading their e-mobility around. And I thought, this is an option. This is a solution if we add a technology layer to link these assets together and give consumers more choices to move around on multiple modes in cities. And that's the way in which we can break a habit of over-reliance on personally owned vehicles and fossil fuel. So for me, that really kicked off a whole investigation. I've been with Uber 5 years. And since then, we've made a commitment to get to 100% EV on Uber by 2030 in the US, Canada, and Europe. And by 2040, everywhere we operate, 70 countries around the world. And for us, that can't just be on electric vehicles, it has to be in car-free modes as well. So bikes and scooters, buses, trains, we want to be a technology layer that can bring that efficiency and bring consumers that basket of choices so that they can push a button and get onto clean modes.
So when you're saying Uber and sustainability, if I hear you correctly, Adam, you're saying you're looking at the possibility of this not just being a ride-hailing app that solely uses cars or even electric vehicles.
Absolutely. We offer multimodal solutions in over 100 major metropolitan areas around the world. For instance, I had the pleasure of being in Paris 2 weeks ago, and Mayor Hidalgo there is a champion of pedestrianization, and following the footsteps of Bogota for more car-free streets and biking and scooters. And Uber works with a number of third-party operators of scooters, electric mopeds, and we integrate them onto the app so that consumers, if you're arriving, you've never been to Paris before, you can open your Uber app just like you would in your home city, and there's a scooter waiting for you nearby. And on a place like Paris, where Mayor Hidalgo has made incredible political steps, Rue de Rivoli, which is a main thoroughfare right by the Louvre, now is 2 lanes of bikes and scooters and 1 lane of cars, which is an unbelievable accomplishment in a major city like Paris. And so you can now push a button, grab one of those scooters as just a visitor, and get around in an emission-free, light vehicle type way, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I hadn't heard of that. What a fascinating anecdote. I want to turn to Secretary Urrutia. Secretary, I want to ask you, you've actually got a question here, and I remind folks, please feel free to submit those questions. We're taking them. Someone is asking, this comes from Tesfaye Desu from Hima University. He's an urban climate change researcher. I shouldn't assume it's a he, I apologize. The question is, can we say global north megacities green infrastructure in a position to the level of GHGs emitted in cities? So Secretary, I guess the question is, what's the role of urban planning and urban growth in triggering land use, land cover change, and urban heat island effective recently changes from small cities in global south? Can you talk a little bit about maybe land use in your own area?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think for cities that are still in a growth process, such as cities in the global south, there's enormous opportunities in terms of land use planning. The first part of it is where we decide to grow and how we decide to grow, right? So what we did in our recent land use plan is we decided, Bogota is a strange city because it's 75% rural. It's not all urban. And we decided not to grow our urban area into the rural area because we do think that in the short and midterm, we need that food to be produced nearer to the city. We need our carbon footprint of the way we consume food in general to go down instead of go up. And that's one thing that we decided to do, especially because in terms of resilience, which is the other big part of this conversation, keeping our green areas green, whether they're rural for food production or our natural protected areas, our parks in general, we want to keep these green and to actually think about planting and greening the city in terms of biodiversity and resilience. So that's one first thing. When you plan land use, you have to make sure that your green areas stay green and that you have enough space to plant all the trees that we're going to need to sink as much carbon as we possibly can within our own frontiers. The second is what we think of as proximity, making sure that services are near to people and planning the city just as Paris did. Paris went for the 15 minutes because they're a lot smaller, right? And we're a lot bigger, so we're thinking in terms of the 30 minutes. How can we model our city to make sure that we have access to schools, universities, hospitals, and places of work within 30 minutes of the main places where people actually live? And that's a huge challenge for Latin American cities, where we have a lot of the poorest and most vulnerable people spending from 2 hours to 2.5 hours in public transport, which is usually not clean. And so that's the third one, how we make sure our transport going forward is a lot cleaner. And that takes a lot of sacrifice for cities such as Bogota, which are so far behind in their infrastructure agenda. That means that we have to build half the city at the same time. And if you talk to anybody who's been in Bogota or who's going to be in Bogota in the next 2 years, you're going to see a city that is griddled in traffic because we're building the infrastructure that hasn't been built in the last 20 years. But the climate emergency makes us see these decisions with a lot greater urgency that we saw in the past. So I think those three sort of sum it all up: proximity, clean transport, and keeping our green areas green.
Great points. Hani, I want to ask you a little bit. You know, Adam, before we started, had said Bogota is actually a city because of their bus rapid transit. Cities like San Francisco are looking to emulate what they are doing. Hani, when you stand back and you look at cities across the world, where do you see the most innovation, greening infrastructure, and where do you feel what they are doing can easily be replicated?
I think that's one thing, an important thing to keep in mind is there really is no one size fits all when it comes to cities. You know, cities have different histories, different land uses, different layouts, different weather patterns, etc. And it's different densities, different economic needs. And it's important to sort of keep that in mind, that you know, what works in Singapore may not necessarily work in Khartoum, or you know, what works in Bogota may not necessarily work in New York City, and so on. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But when we're looking at cities that are willing to innovate, and I think that's really the main thing, cities that are willing to take a chance, innovate, and see if new ideas work. And you look at places like Singapore, for example, when it comes to deploying technologies, when it comes to deploying policies that discourage the use of private vehicles, you know, they've been leading, you know, in that for some time. If you're looking at a city willing to try new technologies like electric urban air mobility, you look at places like Dubai, for instance, but then again, it's a very different kind of city than many of sort of the older cities around the world. When you're looking at innovation in public transport, you look at Bogota, which again was a pioneer in deploying bus rapid transit, and so but then there are other kinds of measures that in fact are perhaps you know, lower hanging fruit. I look at my own city of Chicago that has deployed a wonderful data portal. You know, a data portal is very valuable because now you're making available a lot of data on all of the infrastructures that are operating. All that connectivity, all that sensor information is now shared. And that creates a very valuable tool for research, but it also creates opportunities for entrepreneurs willing to create apps that ultimately can go towards sort of greener objectives. And so there's quite a bit of examples. And Adam has, of course, mentioned Paris, which created quite a stir when they just took away one of the few arteries that actually flowed in Paris and turned it into a pedestrian and bicycle area. And that was, you know, it was a big bet, but it worked out. And so it takes leadership and willingness to try new ideas. You know, if it doesn't work out, one can always do something else, but we need to see more of that willingness to innovate in more of our cities.
That's a great point, Hani. You know, having the political willingness also is important, no matter what great technology you have. And those are hard decisions to make. Adam, I'd love to talk to you a little bit sort of about how you change policy. It's not easy, but in your experience, I mean, you spent your entire career in this field and you started off in California. How do you feel policy can be most effective, and how do you create that change?
Yeah, thanks, Rena. I think, especially when you look at EVs, it's difficult to understate the role of policy. Policy drives EV markets. It just simply does. And if you look at places like California, China, Norway, Netherlands, who have the highest uptake of EVs in the world, it's because it's been driven by policy the last 30 years. But one thing I've been really surprised about is the role that cities can play in that drive. So just to give you for instance, just looking at EVs, there's lots of things to do on policy and sustainable transportation, but I'll just focus on electrification. On Uber, about 1 in 100 miles that are completed on our app in North America are in EVs. It's about 1 in 20 in Europe, but it's about 1 in 10 in London. And so when I look at policy, there's something that Mayor Sadiq Khan has landed on that surprises me as a Californian, because I'm really proud of what we've done with the California Air Resources Board leadership here. But it's something that states and nations can learn from cities and mayors who are willing to have the gumption that Mayor Sadiq Khan has had to take the political leap and install things like congestion charges that exempt EVs, ultra low emission zones that price emissions and start to rein in externalities from automotive transport and emissions. And what we're seeing is that those policies have rewired everyday economics for all drivers participating in the system. And they've sent a clear signal to both the market and consumers that, look, diesel, petrol is going to cost you more and EVs are going to cost you less. So that's allowed us to double down. And so we offer a clean air program to help drivers transition. We've raised 150 million pounds to help support drivers in their transition. So each driver can access 3,000, 4,000 pounds to make a switch to EV. It's allowed us to partner with automakers and rental companies to make EVs available, and charging partners like British Petroleum and others investing in EV fast charging in the area. And so we've seen this kind of new value chain been created, and they've done it mostly through carbon and road pricing, which is, for me, a third leg of the stool. If you've got EV supply policy, EV charging policy, carbon and road pricing have really come out ahead in terms of really driving change, because it hits that consumer behavior that Hani was talking about earlier.
Well, great points. Secretary Urrutia, I want to ask you a little bit, on that subject of having the political will and might. What's your advice as other government officials want to do something to create greener cities, but the political fight might be difficult? How are ways that you move past that you can get them to see the data of why this can make a difference?
So I think, and I fully support the carbon and road pricing issue, and I think we're learning a lot from it, and we're doing both in Bogota with a lot of pushback. And I think a big part of leadership is kind of taking the blows, because the pushback on cars, specifically cars in general, especially in terms of redistributing space for cars, as they were mentioning in the case of Paris, taking lanes away from cars in Bogota is still seen sort of as a fight against the middle class. It's a very politicized and very ideological field of arguments, right? Because we still have this idea that being successful means having a car. So I think we have to move quicker in sort of the cultural transformation of what success can look like for the middle classes facing climate change. And part of that is in the discourse. And the other is you sort of have to get into the fetal position and take the blows, because it's going to happen. And you put forward the arguments and you talk. We have a big advantage here in Bogota, as London did, because we have very serious arguments in terms of health. It's not only an issue of climate change, but it's an issue of the air we're breathing. And in Bogota, we're way behind on our equality goals, despite the fact that we're very ambitious. So we have very good arguments, and it's still politically a very sort of weighted set of arguments in terms of whether you're acting in terms of redistribution, or you're actually gaining space for the middle class specifically. So I think you just have to hold on to your arguments and sort of wade through the difficult times, because the blows are going to come. They came for Mayor Hidalgo in Paris. They've come for Mayor Khan in London. And I think Mayor Claudia Lopez here in Bogota has sort of looked to these two cases and many others and said, you know what, we're going to weather the storm. And we're very sure that the evidence is going to pile up in our favor, both in the midterm and in the long term.
Two great political leaders who have really, you're right, what a great point to highlight. They've really taken a lot of blowback on what they've tried to achieve. Secretary Urrutia, I want to also ask you, were talking a little bit about air quality. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're using citizen science?
So in Bogota, we have around, our studies say that we have around 2,000 premature deaths from health issues related to air quality every year. So we have a very strong case in terms of air quality policies. Now, our air quality monitoring system tells us what's going on in general with the city's air quality, but it doesn't help citizens make their individual decisions. Where to ride my bike, on what road should I ride my bike to get to my destination? What's the air quality situation today? What time should I work out? Should I do it outside? Should I do it inside? And we want our citizens to make those micro decisions in a better manner. So what we're doing is we're helping fund citizen organizations to have low-cost air quality monitors. They don't tell us everything we need in terms to make policy decisions, but they do tell citizens how to make their better decisions in their daily lives. And in terms of COVID, it's been very interesting because people have, or when it was at its worst, people were starting to use these low-cost air quality monitors to determine whether both classrooms or universities or theaters were ready to be opened in terms of what the concentration was inside these spaces. So I think we have a long ways to go. We started our investment last year, but we're hoping to see results by next year and to sort of end this idea that air quality organizations doing advocacy on air quality and the government can't work together. We can give citizens better information if we join forces, and that doesn't mean that the organizations have to agree with everything we do, with all of our policies, but we're sure that we can have better decision making, even in terms of what happens inside buses. We've been changing our buses for the past 3 years, and we've already seen a 75% improvement of the air that people are breathing inside the buses, not just outside. And if we didn't have citizens sort of monitoring that air quality inside the buses, we wouldn't have enough information. So I think working together is always going to be the best bet.
I love that. And I love that how people can actually feel it's something tangible they can do that's really making a difference for their city and their health. It's such a great point. Hani, in the final moments we have left, I want to ask you, as you look around the world, what do you feel when it comes to simple strategies? What is really moving the needle in cities?
Keep in mind that essentially every little bit helps ultimately, and I think, and we have to be unrelenting, I think, in pursuing greener objectives. And so, again, some of these movements towards micromobility, towards more walkability, bicycle use, and so on. They're making a difference, but they're still perhaps not at a large enough scale that we're seeing kind of huge, the kind of improvements that we need. So ultimately, there needs to be a combination of a change in behaviors with some of the technologies that are going to lower our carbon impact, particularly as we talk about electrification, for example. And so the Secretary mentioned essentially crowdsourcing, for example. You mentioned that as citizen science, but the fact that we are collecting data from individuals ultimately that can help in managing our systems, but also in providing feedback to users. And this is where that can really start making a difference, is when we give feedback to users, we provide incentives, and in some ways the incentive can be in the form of gamification, and we've seen many examples where this has been taking place. And so the same platform that you may be using for mobility as a service is the one that's tracking your carbon impact, that's giving you rewards, or maybe a pat on the back, or sharing that with your social network, and so on. So these kind of developments are making an impact, but by themselves they're really not going to be enough ultimately without concerted action.
That's interesting, Hani. I hadn't thought of feedback being important, also incentivizing this to make people also feel good that they're making an impact. I want to give the last word, Adam, to you. And we've got a question from Victoria Reinhardt from St. Paul, Minnesota, with Ramsey County. She's saying the work of cities around the globe is great. how are cities partnering with other local governments, specifically counties, to expand climate change action for a larger geographic area? I want to toss it to you, specifically with Uber. Where do you feel the partnerships and collaboration are the greatest and opportunities that maybe other people could potentially, and other companies and cities could replicate?
Thanks for the question, Rena. And yeah, I think our CEO likes to say that climate's a team sport. And it's difficult to understate that. Honey was just picking up on this. This really is unprecedented what we need to do. If you read the latest IPCC report, we can't move fast enough on the transportation sector in particular. It's the last sector to decarbonize, and it's moving in the wrong direction. There's a great study from UC Davis and ITDP that just came out a couple of months ago that says electrification gets you about 70% there, and then urbanification, transit, walking, biking gets you the remaining 30%, and you need all the things. So that means the best of industry innovation, the best of government policy, and the best of consumer engagement and education and citizen engagement to make this possible. But it can be done. So just a couple of quick examples. For instance, we're starting to see, I'm a big believer that seeing is believing. And COVID has, to Hani's point, been this great experiment. And now the La Ciclovia that Bogota invented, these sort of car-free days where people get on their bikes and get out there, that's been happening throughout COVID. So cities can now experiment with that, get out there, get citizens out on bikes. And there's a lot of resistance at first, but as soon as they do, people get that smile on their face when they're on their bike next to their neighbors. And you can find that not only in Uber's app every day through micro-mobility partnerships that we have, but you can find that in cities like San Francisco and others who have been really experimenting with it. And there's an opportunity for cities to partner with industry leaders who want to see that shared mobility future. One other example is I'm a big believer in ride and drives, because they're the way, once people finally get in an EV for the first time, we call it that EV smile, because you can't help but be like, have this giddiness of a child being in a new technology like that. And on Uber, these days, we have about 15,000 active drivers in North America and Europe participating with us who use EVs, and they're doing almost 2.5 million rides a month. And so it's a big active ride and drive, including people in electric mobility. It's citizens helping citizens get in rides. And a lot of that has to do with government policies, making EVs more affordable for drivers and investing in EV infrastructure. And then us bringing a technology layer that makes it easier to push a button and get in an EV. And over time, what we hope is that technology and that data can help support infrastructure investments, because you've got the Biden administration, the state of California spending more than they ever have on EV infrastructure. And we think that there's some of the data of users interacting with the system using electric mobility will help de-risk taxpayer investments in EV infrastructure, which are so necessary to help cities electrify their transportation system. So we think this is just the beginning, and we're really looking forward to partnering with folks both across the industry and in government.
That's some great points you make there, Adam. I want to thank you very much, Adam Gromis from Uber, Hani Mamasani from Northwestern, and Secretary Carolina Urrutia, Secretary of Environment, Bogota, Colombia. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for making the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And next up, we have a special message from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. She's going to talk about how we can translate climate ambition into action.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora to everyone attending the Foreign Policy Climate Summit. The summit is about one of the most urgent challenges we all face. So today, I want to give you 3 messages, 3 things we all can think about to build our collaborations and individual actions that sit across policy, civil society, and the private sector. First, like the pandemic, the climate crisis requires us to put science at the front of our response. In the Pacific, we have long known that climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security and well-being of our people. And the science is now illustrated by our lived experience. Urgent, transformative global action is the only credible response to climate change. We have to halve emissions by the end of this decade, and at the same time, we need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The science tells us that there are limits in what people, communities and nature can adapt to. This makes the need to reduce emissions all the more urgent. The message from science is simple. We need all countries, but particularly the 20 largest emitters that are responsible for 80% of the global emissions, to revisit their Paris commitments in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. We need policymakers, the private sector, and civil society all to be taking decisions aligned with that 1.5 degrees limit. He waka eke noa, we're in the same canoe and we must paddle together. The message is simple, but it has big implications. Halving global emissions means transformational change. If we are successful, 2030 will not look anything like 2022. If we are on track, change will be evident. As decision makers, we need to ask ourselves, is this the massive change evident in our everyday life and in our decisions? And if not, we are part of the problem. Second, it is not good enough to be ambitious for the future. We need to be acting and implementing detailed plans now. By the end of May, New Zealand will have completed its first emissions reduction plan, with actions in every sector and across society to decarbonise and transform our economy. We need all decision makers throughout the economy to take climate change into account and into their accounting, making sure it is reflected in bottom lines, emissions pricing, and not relying on environmentally harmful subsidies. Requiring financial disclosure of climate change risks, as we do, is a powerful tool. We must face our hardest challenges head on. New Zealand is a geographically distant trading nation, and we want ambitious action on maritime emissions. A significant proportion of our emissions are from agriculture. We're investing in research and we're working with farmers and growers on how we will price these emissions from 2025. We've also set absolute reduction targets for biogenic methane. Third, to make these transformative steps, we need to keep our people at the heart of what we do. We must learn the lessons of the past when poorly managed crises have hurt families, communities and regions. There's not a reason not to act, but to anticipate and address negative impacts, to be conscious that those impacts will not be evenly distributed and that care for our people, all our people, must be at the centre of what we do. New Zealand has put an end to future offshore oil and gas exploration. When we did that, we also invested in the future of the communities most impacted to build with them a just transition. We've established tools like the independent advice and monitoring of our Climate Change Commission to give expert advice and frank feedback on our actions. All of these are ways in which we are trying to ensure our actions are transparent, understood, well-grounded, and bought into by our people. Finally, we can only succeed in addressing the daunting reality of the climate crisis by working together. It has been tempting in the past to say that the multilateral system isn't delivering the solutions, or that governments aren't doing their part, or that industry is the problem. Each of us has a part to play. Scientists, governments, communities, neighbours, individuals. We share our planet, and working together is the best chance to heal it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Sadegova. I'm the Vice President here at Foreign Policy, and I'm here today to wrap up Day 1 of Climate Summit. We've just heard from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. Wow, what a powerful message. The Prime Minister has been a passionate advocate and global champion for the environment, and we're so grateful that she shared her message with FB's audience today. We had a series of really fascinating conversations this morning about cross-sector solutions to climate challenges. We heard remarks from a number of government and industry leaders, including U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry, Foreign Minister of Egypt and President-designate for COP27, Sameh Shoukry, Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and also a number of industry leaders and CEOs about the role of critical metals in energy transition, about technologies to decarbonize the grid, about investing in resilient and smart cities. If you miss any part of the program, it will be available to watch on our website later today. I hope today's sessions have inspired and informed you. I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm excited to continue the conversation tomorrow with many more impressive speakers and panel discussions. Please do not forget to check out the list of related content from Foreign Policy and Foreign Policy Analytics. that builds on today's conversations. You can find them below your video player on our event page. And tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m., we'll be joined by former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Her Majesty Queen Rani of Jordan, President Carlos Alvarado Quesada of Costa Rica, and many, many more others. Hope you can tune in. I want to take a second also to recognize our partners who made the summit possible. Those are Bayer, BHP, Shopify, Nuclear Energy Institute, and Buffett Institute for Global Affairs of Northwestern. And finally, please make sure to check foreignpolicy.com/events for the full list of upcoming events, including one taking place on May 10th, on Tuesday, the American war in Afghanistan. With that, this is it from me now. Thank you again very much for joining, and see you again tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bye for now.